Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Asia-Pacific Regional Consultation on the priority theme of the 66th session of the Commission on the Status of Women. This year's theme is Achieving Gender Equality and the Empowerment of All Women and Girls in the context of climate change, environmental and disaster risk reduction policies and programs. I'm Shano Usan, Social Affairs Officer with the Gender Equality and Social Inclusion section of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, and I will serve as MC for this regional consultation. This consultation is jointly convened by the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific and the United Nations Entity for Gender Equality and the Empowerment of Women, in collaboration with the United Nations Development Programme, the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, the United Nations Population Fund, the United Nations Children's Fund, and the United Nations Environment Programme. We are very honored to be joined today by representatives from so many ESCAP member states and representatives from civil society, academia, intergovernmental organizations, UN entities, private sector, as well as other esteemed partners and colleagues. The outcome of the Asia-Pacific Regional Consultation for CSW66 will be a set of recommendations on areas for accelerated action, in line with the priority theme for CSW66. The recommendations will feed into the CSW66 discussions and can inform membership contributions to the agreed conclusions. The set of recommendations on areas for accelerated action will be informed by the three substantive sessions as follows. Number one, understanding the gendered impacts of climate change, environment degradation, and disaster risk reduction. Number two, regional and national gender transformative policies on climate change, environment, and disaster risk reduction. And number three, women as actors of climate change, environment management, and disaster risk reduction. Each session consists of three segments: an overview presentation on the theme, a panel discussion, and discussions in plenary. 40 to 45 minutes have been allocated to the last segment of each session, the discussions in plenary. Following our opening remarks today, we will run the first two of these three thematic sessions today. Tomorrow, we will have the third thematic session and a brief review of the recommendations. Kindly note that as we are a large group of more than 400 participants, all attendees will be muted and their cameras switched off, with the exception of attendees who are requested to speak during the plenary session. If you have not done so already, we kindly ask that you rename yourself to include your full name and country or organization. We have auto-generated closed captions for this event that you can enable in your Zoom settings at the bottom of your screen. We are also providing international sign language, and the interpreter should be visible to all. We also wish to inform you that this meeting is being recorded and that the recording will be made publicly available after the conclusion of the meeting. If you experience any technical problems, please use the chat box to ask for assistance. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I now have the honor of inviting Mr. Kaveh Saidi, Deputy Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, to deliver his opening remarks. Mr. Saidi, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chane, and distinguished representatives of our member states and civil society organizations, dear partners, dear colleagues from the UN family, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of ESCAP, and of course together with my colleague Sarah Nibs, the Regional Director AI of UN Women, it really is an absolute pleasure to welcome you to the Asia-Pacific Regional Consultation on the priority theme of the 66th session of the Commission on the Status of Women. Chani mentioned the theme of our session, achieving gender equality in the context of climate change, environmental crisis, and disaster risk. And of course, this is a theme that absolutely resonates within our region, as well as contributing well over half of the global greenhouse gas emissions, and as well as experiencing widespread environmental degradation. The Asia-Pacific region is also the most disaster-prone in the world and home to some of the countries most affected by climate risks. Our region is already facing an increase in the frequency and intensity of climate-related hazards, what we call a new riskscape. And in this new riskscape, women and girls are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and rising disasters due to some very deep-rooted and persistent inequalities in social, economic, cultural, political systems. We've seen the evidence, and it shows that climate change has severe adverse impacts on women's livelihood opportunities. It increases their paid and unpaid workloads, and of course forces many to undertake high-risk and hazardous activities. In our region of Asia Pacific, and indeed globally, disasters generally lead to higher death rates among women. For example, 55% of victims of the 2015 earthquake in Nepal were women and girls. And of course, this is one small example amongst the many within our own region. In the words of our Secretary General, the Secretary General of the United Nations, and I quote, "The climate crisis affects us all, but its impacts often fall most heavily on women and girls," end quote. And women's lack of access to resources and assets clearly limits their ability to adapt to what is a changing environmental conditions, and indeed to recover from disasters once they have struck. Disasters also increase the risk and incidence of violence against women and girls and disrupt access to sexual and reproductive health services. Caregiving responsibilities, lack of access to finances, lower education and literacy rates, and limited involvement in community decisions are just a few of the reasons why women and girls choose to stay put, even in the face of a disaster. And the list of these knock-on effects goes on and is extensive. Climate change-related environmental shifts disproportionately impact women and girls. In many rural areas, women are more dependent on natural resources for their livelihoods and are responsible for providing food, shelter, fuel, and water. As the environment changes, many of these tasks have simply become more physically demanding and time-consuming, and of course may involve exposure to new risks, including the risk of violence while traveling further from home or being out during earlier or later hours. For some women, these means of providing for themselves and their families have become unmanageable, and they've had to relocate to survive. Globally, women and girls make up to 80% of people who have been displaced due to climate change. So, Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, urgent and ambitious action on climate change is slowly being recognized as an integral part of our development, of building back better and of achieving sustainable development, especially for the most vulnerable. If there is a silver lining, it is the opportunity that the climate crisis and indeed the current pandemic present to re-examine and reform existing systems to achieve a more equitable, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable future. In our session today and in the lead up to the CSW, we will need to work hard to ensure that the opportunity of reform is not lost for women and girls. And to do so, allow me to outline just a few key actions at the start of our conversation. First, we cannot achieve the needed transformations without more women decision makers at the table. Women are still underrepresented in high levels of government, including in parliament and even as environment-related ministers. Put simply, women, including from civil society, indigenous and other groups, need to be meaningfully included in shaping policy responses at all levels. Second, addressing existing structural inequalities is an absolute prerequisite. The vulnerability of women and girls to climate change and disasters is not innate. It is the result of existing norms, existing practices. As governments respond to climate change and disasters, policymakers need to ensure new jobs, infrastructure, and response mechanisms do not simply replicate existing gender inequalities. Removing barriers to education, for example, land ownership, and formal employment is integral to a coherent and holistic government response. Third, we need to produce and use timely and reliable sex disaggregated data to better understand and make increasingly visible the gendered differences in climate change and disasters. In our region of Asia Pacific, sufficient data is only available for 2 of the 9 targets of SDG 5 on gender equality. In many ways, we are running blind. In addition to sex disaggregated data for quantitative indicators, qualitative data is also important to understand the intersectional experiences of women from different geographical areas, ethnicities, races, ages, abilities, and so on. Governments need to ensure that new policies on climate change, on the environment, and on disaster risk reduction include provisions for monitoring the impact on gender equality and on the empowerment of women and girls. And finally, issues of gender cannot be separated from issues of climate, disasters, environment, and more broadly, frankly, sustainable development. Governments should foster collaboration between women's ministries and organizations and those that govern climate change, environment, and disaster risk management. And that's why I'm so very pleased to see so many of these different parts of government and so many of these different sectors represented in the meeting with us today. Gender considerations should be included in nationally determined contributions in the UNFPA process, in national adaptation plans, in national biodiversity strategies, and of course, disaster risk reduction plans. I really do welcome the strong participation of the many government officials from various sectors and the many diverse stakeholders in our regional consultation, and we really welcome hearing from you, from the angle, from the perspective, that the valuable perspective that you bring. And of course, we recognize and appreciate the very broad-based UN platform that has come together for this meeting as well. We can work together to ensure that the gender dimensions and their impact are considered in climate change and disaster risk reduction policies and strategies, sharing promising practices and lessons learned, and ensuring the gender lens is used in all the processes in which we are engaged is key, not only to ensuring that no woman and no girl is being left behind, but also probably to healing our planet. At ESCAP, of course, we stand ready to support all of our member states, our stakeholders, our partners in ensuring that women and girls are at the center of climate action as we work together to build a more equitable, a more sustainable, and a climate resilient world. I thank you very much. Chane, back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Sahidi, for highlighting some of the key essential steps member states and other stakeholders can take to promote the empowerment of women and girls and reduce inequalities, while also calling attention to the need for urgent and ambitious action on climate change. I now have the pleasure of inviting Ms. Sarah Nips, Regional Director at Interim of the UN Women Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific, to deliver her opening remarks. Ms. Nips, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chane. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and good afternoon to all of you. On behalf of UN Women's Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific, I'd like to add my welcome to you all, to that of our co-host for this regional consultation, ESCAP, represented here today by the Deputy Executive Secretary, Kaveh Zahidi, as well as Srinivas Tata and Chai Chai. I would like to express my very warm appreciation to all of you for making time for this two-day regional consultation on the priority theme for the 66th session of the CSW, which, as you know, is achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls in the context of climate change, environmental and disaster risk reduction policies and programs. I would also like to take this opportunity to warmly acknowledge the partnership and collaboration of the UN entities that have come together to support this activity. The UNDP, UNDRR, UNFPA, and UNEP. The priority theme is particularly important, as we've already heard, for this region, which has also been described as the most disaster-prone region in the world. We know it is also one of the most vulnerable to climate change and related impacts, which have already affected the agricultural sector, the productivity and economic viability of both inshore and deep water fisheries, and have translated into damage, loss, and increased costs of maintenance to human settlements and infrastructure investments, both social and physical. In terms of the impacts on human lives, the International Federation of Red Cross has documented that over 57 million individuals were affected by floods and cyclones in 2021 alone. We know that South Asia, particularly India, Bangladesh, and Nepal, have suffered severe losses due to a series of unprecedented disaster events with little time to recover. While most recently, Tonga experienced a volcanic eruption and tsunami, where some 84,000 individuals, or 80% of the population, were severely affected. Disasters across the region have compounded the impacts of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, further increasing poverty, magnifying inequalities, and worsening the vulnerability of women and girls and other vulnerable and marginalized groups and communities across our region. Indeed, an empirical study conducted by UN Women has highlighted how different climate-related crises translated to damaging outcomes for women and girls, such as child marriage, adolescent births, violence against women and girls, and increasing time burdens on women and effects on their well-being. For women who often lack ownership of land, productive and financial assets, and social protection, coping with such challenges has been especially challenging. At the same time, the important leadership and stewardship role that women have played in natural resource management and conservation efforts is also not sufficiently reflected. As such, women's situational knowledge continues to be underutilized in environmental policies and disaster risk reduction efforts and strategies. And regressively, the availability of both qualitative and quantitative data on the connections between gender equality and climate change still remains a challenge. And as such, key concerns continue to be overlooked by policymakers and other stakeholders. Further, women continue to be underrepresented in decision-making about the environment. To address these challenges, we must build coalitions of support to advance gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls by integrating gender perspectives in climate change, environmental and DRR policies and programs, by promoting women's and girls' full and equal participation and leadership to make natural resource management and climate, environment and DRR more effective, by expanding gender responsive finance at scale for climate and environment action and to reach women's organizations, enterprises and cooperatives, as well as by building women's resilience in the context of agricultural and food systems, forest and fisheries management, and the sustainable energy transition. Finally, we must look at enhancing gender statistics and sex disaggregated data in the gender environment nexus and fostering gender responsive just transitions. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, the consultation over the next 2 days will discuss topics that were most recently raised at the 26th session of the Conference of the Parties, the COP26. These topics are also key for advancing the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the SDGs. During these days, we will have an opportunity to hear from diverse stakeholders, including government, academia, civil society actors, international NGOs, international financial institutions, UN entities, and others, about the urgency of collectively accelerating action on these issues, particularly in our policies, programs, and our financing of these areas. We invite you all to actively engage in these discussions and to both contribute to and benefit from the knowledge and good practices of different countries and stakeholders. We hope that the recommendations that will be generated from these consultations will inform the inputs of governments within this region to the negotiations on the agreed conclusions for the CSW66. We hope to see the region come together for greater cooperation to inform membership contributions to the agreed conclusions. It is also hoped that these discussions will inform policy actions in response to the Glasgow Climate Pact cover decision, which encouraged parties to increase the full, meaningful and equal participation of women in climate action and to ensure gender responsive implementation and means of implementation, which are vital for raising ambition and achieving climate goals. And also called upon parties to strengthen the implementation of the enhanced Lima Work Programme on gender and its gender action plan. In closing, I would like to thank you all once again for joining these consultations, and we hope you'll be able to join us for both days, and we look forward to very fruitful deliberations and outcomes. Thank you so much, and over to you, Jenny.
Thank you, Ms. Nips, very much for your opening remarks and for underscoring the important role that women and girls play in leading responses to climate change, environmental degradation, and disaster risk reduction planning. I now have the pleasure of inviting Ms. Olga Janeva, Executive Director of ALGA, Rural Women's Organization of Kyrgyzstan, to deliver her opening remarks. ALGA is one of the member organizations of the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development, part of the Gender Equality Forum's Climate Action Coalition, and she has been actively engaged in the CSW process for more than a decade. Ms. Janeva, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Shana. Good morning, Your Excellencies, distinguished speakers, honorable members and delegates. It is a privilege to be invited to speak in this consultation prior to the CSW66. I'm especially privileged to be able to amplify the voices of the perspectives of members of the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development spread across from more than 30 countries in Asia and the Pacific region, including my own organization, Rural Women's Association ALGA from Kyrgyzstan. Women in Asia and the Pacific, in all of their diversities, are confronting the worsening climate crisis on a daily basis, and the evidence of these adverse impacts and struggles of the women on the ground has been reiterated in the national progress reports of many member states during the Beijing Plus 25 review. Cambodia is ranked as one of the most vulnerable countries in the world to climate change and disasters with the least capacity to adapt. Bangladesh has reported that the climate crisis is adversely affecting women's health, lives and livelihoods, particularly due to the rising water salinity and loss of water and sanitation facilities. In the Pacific, Fiji and Marshall Islands are trying to survive despite having more and more uninhabitable islands. The countries also reported that women have lost income from traditional livelihoods due to the drought and have been internally displaced due to climate-induced natural disasters. My country, Kyrgyzstan, has witnessed a rapid average temperature increase of 8 degrees Celsius during this century. Your Excellencies, it became clearer every day that many countries in Asia and the Pacific region are experiencing existential threat due to the current climate catastrophe. Yes, we are witnessing how critical negotiations to tackle climate emergencies such as the COP26 remain dominated by the fossil fuel industry, the main sector behind 85% of the global climate issues. During the negotiations, women, along with the many member countries from Asia and the Pacific, were voiceless and underrepresented as a result of vaccine inequality and colonialistic approach of the UK government, one among the countries accountable to put all of us in this fast track to the climate apocalypse. We are deeply concerned about the increasing corporate greed in climate negotiations and the continuous promotion of business as usual, hiding behind the so-called climate ambitions, oppressing women and violating their human rights. Feminist and grassroots women movements continue to present substantial analysis on how the current system needs to be redefined to achieve environmental justice for the peoples. On the occasion of this regional consultation, we are reiterating the importance of dismantling the root causes of climate injustices, immediate fossil fuel phase out, holding polluters accountable for their historical and ongoing responsibility while promoting energy democracy that upholds women's human rights for just and equitable transition from the current climate crisis and the fundamental need of an hour. Developed countries must drastically cut their emissions by 2030 to prevent further losses and damages and to provide financing facility based on the principles of common but differentiated responsibilities to assist developing countries in coping with the impacts. The support given must be based on the needs, consent, and determined direction of the countries in need. We call on member states to develop and implement gender-responsive policy and budgeting to promote women's human rights and gender equality and create an enabling environment for grassroots women to demand accountability at all levels. Further, we call on member states to support community-based climate solutions, strengthen the ambitions and implementation of national determined contributions, including by upholding women's human rights, ensuring the meaningful participation, leadership, and reflection of women's voices and priorities in all stages, including the planning and implementation of the national climate solutions. Throughout history, major crises have resulted in significant political, economic, and social changes, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. We must ask ourselves whether we want to recover on a healthier planet for all of us, or do we want to keep on pursuing the path of climate apocalypse? Women across Asia and the Pacific region are determined to strengthen our solidarity, marching towards a just and equitable transition from this global crisis. We call upon everyone in this room to hear our voices and march together for system change and not climate change. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Geneva, for sharing from a CSO perspective how we can work together to ensure women and girls are at the center of climate change and disaster risk reduction responses. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our opening session. We will now proceed to our first substantive session on understanding the gendered impacts of climate change, environment degradation, and disasters. And I now have the pleasure of introducing the moderator for our first session. Ms. Chai Chai is the Chief of the Gender Equality and Social Inclusion section of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. Ms. Chai Chai has over 20 years of experience with the United Nations at the country, sub-regional and regional levels, covering a wide range of socio-economic issues in the larger context of sustainable development. Ms. Chai Chai, please, the floor is yours.
Good morning, distinguished participants. Warm welcome to the first session on understanding the gendered impacts of climate change, environmental degradation, and disasters. This session will focus on building an understanding around the gender impacts of environment, climate change, and disasters in the Asia-Pacific region. We will discuss women's unpaid care and domestic work, gender-based violence, sexual and reproductive health, as well as migration and displacement, and how to strengthen climate change mitigation, response, and adaptation efforts. The pandemic has heightened the imminent environmental and climate crisis, which is eroding a number of hard-fought gender gains made towards achieving equality for women and girls. Interlinked with the care and livelihood crises, climate-related health risks and disasters are deepening the unpaid care burden faced by women and girls. They are becoming the invisible shock absorbers, experiencing greater struggles when conducting tasks critical to the survival of their families and communities, such as sourcing food, fuel, and water. Last year, ESCAP published a report on the unpaid care economy in Asia and the Pacific in the context of COVID-19, as well as a forward-looking joint effort with ASEAN on addressing unpaid care work in ASEAN region. This has already resulted in adoption of a comprehensive ASEAN framework on the care economy. Change is happening as we speak. The climate crisis has also resulted in increased incidents of gender-based violence due to displacement and breakdown of support systems, and affected health services and reproductive rights. We should recognize these impacts and the prevalence of gender-based violence and harmful practices, and ensure the implementation of policy frameworks around these issues. Further, the climate crisis is leading to greater migration and displacement. In these circumstances, women's adaptive capacities are hindered due to social cultural norms, limited livelihood choices, absence of social protection, and lack of financial assets and rights to land and property ownership. Therefore, adopting a gender lens and supporting women and girls' participation in climate action is critical to understanding and tackling the environmental and climate crisis. It is my pleasure to moderate this first session. We will begin with an intro presentation, followed by panel interventions, and then a plenary discussion with participants. Now, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Sonia Akhter, who will be providing the overview. Dr. Akhter is an assistant professor at the Lee Kwang Tuan School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. Her research is on the nexus of agriculture, environment, and development in the Asia-Pacific region. She has worked extensively on agriculture and food policy, natural disasters, and women's empowerment in South and Southeast Asia. Dr. Akhter, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning from Singapore. And thank you very much for inviting me to deliver this overview presentation for this session. I'm deeply honored. So before I begin my presentation, I would like to give you a global landscape of policy frameworks that highlights the urgency of gender equality in climate change, both in the context of achieving gender equality and women's empowerment, as well as climate change mitigation, adaptation, and gender risk reduction. So there's a number of key international frameworks that calls for nations to increase women's participation and leadership in climate change and disaster risk reduction platforms. Some examples are the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015-2030, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Sustainable Development Goals. So in line with the urgency and prominence attached to gender issues in climate change mitigation and adaptation, the theme of the 66th session of the Commission on the Status of Women is highly consistent, and the theme is achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls in the context of climate change, environment, and disaster risk reduction policies and programs. So climate change impacts are not gender neutral. This fact is widely recognized across academics, scholars, practitioners, and policymakers. So on the left side of the screen, there is a framework that is developed by World Bank and FAO. So this framework identifies some key climate change impacts that affect women disproportionately. And in the next segment of my talk, I will discuss the drivers of gender differentiated impacts of climate change under 4 broad categories. So these categories are gender norms, roles, and gender division of labor, pre-existing gender inequality in the society, and women's sexual and reproductive health needs and gender-based violence. So we all know that gender norms vary across societies and across countries and communities, and men and women play different roles and different functions within the household as well as outside the households. So most commonly in the rural areas, women are primarily predominantly responsible for fuel and water collection. And as climate change affects fuel and water availability, it increases women's unpaid work burden. Women are also predominantly responsible for taking care of children and elderly household members. So they are also responsible to care for the livestock, poultry, and other household assets. Research has shown that women lack vital life skills like running, swimming, and tree climbing. And they also dress differently than men. They tend to wear long clothes, tend to have long hairs, and all these factors combined impede women's mobility and impede their ability to flee in the wake of a rapid onset natural disaster, resulting in higher incidence of female mortality in the wake of a rapid onset natural disaster like flooding, like cyclone, and tornado and earthquake. And next driver is pre-existing gender inequality. So even in the absence of climate change and absence of any natural disaster, there are gender inequality in the society, and women face inequality in a wide range of spheres in life. Some examples are women tend to be poorer than men, they lack asset and land ownership. Women in patriarchal society, women's status is subordinate in the society, so that they lack decision-making power. Women tend to spend more time doing unpaid household work, and their work is undervalued and unrecognized. When women participate in the labor market, they face gender wage gap, and they're overrepresented in low skill, low wage work and informal sector. And there's also intra-household discrimination of resource and food allocation. They lack access to education, they lack access to information technology. So all of these inequalities which prevail even during normal time, these existing inequalities exacerbate and intensify when climate change induces financial hardship and resources scarcity. So research has shown that households adjust their consumption when they experience an income shock, a crop failure. They adjust their expenses on the margin of women and girls' well-being. As a result, when there is a rainfall shock or crop failure, the incidence of girl child mortality rate is much higher than boy child mortality. So next category of drivers are women's sexual and reproductive health needs. This is a major area where men and women are very different, their needs are very different, and this is one fundamental difference between men and women that drives the gender differentiated impacts of climate change. So climate change induced food insecurity, for instance, more adversely affect women and children than men, particularly women who are in their reproductive age, women who are pregnant or lactating women, and young children whose requirement for nutrition is very different than the other members of the household. And also climate change and natural disaster increases barriers for meeting women's and girls' sexual and reproductive health needs, such as access to contraception, access to prenatal, postnatal healthcare services. And oftentimes we do observe that after natural disaster, there is high rate of unplanned and pregnancy, and as well as adolescent pregnancies, which leads to very poor birth outcomes for both mother and the children, including mortality, maternal mortality, low birth weight. And climate change induced financial hardships are also linked to increased incidence of forced and early marriage for girls. And the final driver is gender specific violence. So gender specific based violence exists even during normal time, but in the wake of a natural disaster and climate change induced hardship, gender-based violence spikes, the incidence of gender-based violence spikes. We have observed this even in the aftermath of the COVID-19 related financial shock, and from all over the world, both rural and urban areas, the reports started surging that number of domestic violence as well as other types of violence against women, such as cyber sex crimes, child sex abuse increased. So some of the drivers of these increased rate of gender-based violence are disaster-induced stress, alcohol abuse, breakdown of law and order, as well as breakdown of the formal and informal support system that keep women safe during regular time. And also there is a study in India that shows that demand for dowry increases when there is a weather shock. And more specifically, a 1 standard deviation fluctuation of rainfall below its long-term mean results in a almost 8% rise in dowry deaths and 4% increase in domestic violence in India. So this is the last slide of my presentation, where I would like to lay down some major areas of policy intervention, major areas where policy intervention is urgently needed. We can discuss the details during the panel discussion session. So these 3 areas are gender inclusive and responsive disaster risk reduction programs, and gender inclusive social safety net programs, and gender mainstreaming in climate change adaptation program. So I would end my presentation here, and any question and any discussion around the themes and topics that I presented, and any question, I'll be happy to address and answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Akhtar, for framing our discussion today and highlighting some of the key drivers in which climate change disproportionately affects women and girls. And you highlighted the gender norms and the gender division of labor, as well as a pre-existing gender inequality, which amplify these impacts. Thank you again for this important intro presentation. Now, I will begin our panel discussion. I will introduce each of our 3 panelists before asking them the questions. Panelists will have 5 minutes to answer the first round of questions. Following the first round, each panelist will have 2 minutes to provide final comments. May I please ask all the panelists to turn on your camera for a screenshot along with Dr. Akhtar. I suggest all panelists keep your camera on during the entire session. Our first panelist is Mr. Gerard Achbata. He is a statistician at the Policy and Cooperation Department in the National Statistics Office of Mongolia. Mr. Achbata was part of the joint team between NSO Mongolia and UN Women, which implemented the Making Every Woman and Girl Counts in Mongolia, improving gender statistics with a focus on environment project. Mr. Achbata, we would like to ask you 2 questions for the first round. What are, in your views, the main key challenges to sourcing gender disaggregated data or data in general within the context of climate change, environment, degradation, and disasters? Going forward, how do you think data can or should be collected in order to analyze the gendered nature of climate change, environment, and disaster risks? And what support is needed to do so? Could you also elaborate on whether you have found any data that explains the gendered impacts of climate change, environmental degradation, and disaster risks. And in your view, may we best use this data to advance gender responsive policies and programs? Thank you. Over to you.
All right, thank you, Chacha. And thank you. Good morning to everyone, and thank you for having me as a panelist. In our recent years, the National Statistics Office of Mongolia have successfully implemented the relatively new and big projects on the gender statistics with support from the international organizations. And most recently, within the initiative, the Making Every Woman and Girl Count, and very close collaboration with the UN Women, National Statistics Office of Mongolia was able to successfully complete the project named Improving Gender Statistics with a focus on environment. As a part of this project, the National Statistics Office of Mongolia conducted 2 surveys. One survey was focused on the herder women, and another survey was focused on the environment and disaster. And for the challenges, collecting the gender disaggregated data in general, and also with a focus on the environment, requires more additional funding and the technical assistance from the expert organizations on these areas. Because the gender surveys are quite different compared to the traditional statistical surveys and questionnaires, and requires more specific data collection methods and the techniques. And without help from the supports from the international and expert organizations, it's almost impossible for us to conduct such gender-specific surveys. And here I would like to note that I express my gratitude towards the UN Women Regional Office, and specifically to Ms. Sara Duarte Valero, the Regional Advisor on the Gender Statistics. And from this survey, we found that for Mongolia, women in remote areas are more prone to the climate change and disasters, because for Mongolia, almost half of the population is living in remote areas and living in more traditional nomadic ways and herding their livestock. And we found that the Mongolian harsh winters and climate change during the summers and climate phenomena are more impacting to women in remote and rural areas compared to the urban areas. And going forward, I hope that the gender data we were able to generate with this project would help the policymakers design more gender responsive policies and programs on the climate change and this disaster risk reduction. And lastly, I would like to inform you that the National Statistics Office of Mongolia will try to continue to conduct such gender surveys with the focus on the environment more regular basis, with the collaboration with the UN Women and other international organizations. And thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Mr. Aherbata, for sharing with us the efforts made by Mongolia in improving gender statistics and how to utilize this data you have collected to enhance policy and programs. Now we will come back to you for second round of questions, and let me move to our second panelist, Ms. Subalakshmi Nandi. Ms. Nandi is a senior program officer on global policy, advocacy, and gender equality at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. She has a 19-year professional journey in the field of gender and development, mainly in the Asia-Pacific region, working on issues of unpaid care work, informal employment, social protection, and gender-based violence. Prior to joining the foundation, she had worked in research, advocacy, and with UN Women. So now, Ms. Nandi, the question I have for you is, in your research, you have analyzed the unpaid care work burden compounded by climate-related health risks, environmental degradation, and disasters. How, in your view, is the intensification of unpaid care and domestic work impacting climate action within Asia and the Pacific? And what do you consider to be the impact of the care crisis on climate change, environment, and disasters? Also, if you can share what is the Gates Foundation's approach to gender and climate change, and how would you recommend interlocking the care economy and the green economy to empower women and girls in Asia and Pacific? Over to you, Ms. Nandi.
Thank you so much, Chai Chai. I hope you can hear me clearly. I think it's such a timely conversation, and it's a privilege to be able to join you all here. I think we all know that, you know, sort of 80% of unpaid and care work in our region is done by women. We also know that it is not just childcare or care of families, but it's or maintenance of, you know, households. It is also very much, you know, the unpaid work that women are doing on farms, as well as in protection and preserving the commons. It's you know, all of that is economic activity contributing indirectly to the economy, but is completely invisible. So I think you know, I also feel like in many ways post-pandemic we have the opportunity to kind of press the reset button, as many people are saying, to not to business as usual. I think when we talk of accelerated action for bringing gender and climate justice into the heart of all sustainable development work, I think it's really timely. Like I said, the pandemic has reminded us how fragile and vulnerable we are as a planet. But I also think for many of the stakeholders here, we are all very geared up, and certainly at the Gates Foundation, we believe this is the decade of action for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Agenda. It's kind of now or never. And also, I think what we've had a really great opportunity working with many of you over the last couple of years as part of the Generation Equality Forum process. We are one of the co-leads on the Economic Justice and Rights Action Coalition, but I know there are many here also from the Feminist Action for Climate Justice group. And I do feel that this has given us the opportunity as governments, civil society, philanthropies, and a range of sort of players across the globe to come together and reiterate our commitment. So I think that's where I'm coming from in this conversation, is that it's also an opportunity for us to strengthen our partnerships as we try and address this agenda. Because let's face it, it's, you know, there are a bunch of other sort of effects that we will see, a lot of impact that we will see if we were to focus on strengthening care systems. If we were to focus on care economy, we would see better human development outcomes. We would see better economic growth. There are some early estimates our partners are doing, which says that, you know, about $3 to $4 trillion will be added to global GDP. Jobs will be created. You know, the ILO estimates, we know, you know, the Care Jobs report is out there for us to see. So if we are looking at, you know, solutions in the care economy, I think it will really help economies to become more resilient. And within that, it will really help women and girls on a wide range of outcomes, and not just alleviate their unpaid care work. So, and of course, there are some estimates which are saying that especially in low and middle income countries, the gender wage gap can be addressed if we were to focus on strengthening care systems by a 22% reduction, some estimates say. And I think the policy solutions that Dr. Akhtar spoke about, and most of you are actually in the day-to-day business of doing, definitely we have to consider social transfers and you know, the whole importance of putting cash in the hands of women as we are looking at building out the resilience. There is experience, enough experience from around the world, how that can help us overcome, you know, the adverse effects of any disaster, but also how it can really drive, you know, more resilience for societies and economies. We also know that it's not just about social transfers and social protection, but we have to talk to a wide range of ministries and departments and agencies about better infrastructure. The unpaid care work that women are doing, a lot of it is water collection in our regions, fuel and fodder collection. It is, so if we are not thinking about energy policy being gender responsive or water policy being gender responsive, then I think we will miss the boat. We have to think about mainstreaming gender in those sectors. And I think the other thing we must really do, and I feel it's a little bit the role of governments, but a little bit a role of wider stakeholders, is how are we shifting the gender norms around how we value and understand women's work. The unpaid care and domestic work, the communal work that women are doing, it is a public good, right? It is something that everybody should be doing. And the drudgery of that should not be on women alone. So how do we talk about the redistribution of that work within families, across the public and private sector, and what are the policies that are required to strengthen that? And finally, I think the most important thing that we believe in is, ultimately, if there is no data and evidence, the problem doesn't exist. And so continued support in statistical systems, in research, in engagement of that research with a wide range of data users to make sure that, that we actually understand the problem for what it is, that we are actually designing evidence-based policies informed by that data. And really, like I said, for us, we fundamentally believe there are several opportunities for us to just come together in partnership and make sure that gender and climate justice is at the heart of this entire economic recovery discussion. I think we have a long way to go, but just having seen some of the really exciting outcomes in the Generation Equality Forum, I know that we can work with a range of partners with our differences, come onto the same table, agree on a few things, and really advance the shared agenda. As part of the Economic Justice and Rights Action Coalition for the CSW in March, we are collaborating also with the Feminist Action for Climate Justice Action Coalition for a shared event. I think other than the question of unpaid work, the two other major issues that I think we must think about is women's voice and representation in discussions where these policies are made. I think that is a very, very important agenda. And the final one is the financing agenda, right? Ultimately, if there are no resources for it, I hope Nolene and others will talk a bit more about that. But, as philanthropies, we can support governments in their domestic efforts. We can support you with bridging knowledge gaps. We can provide technical assistance. But at the end of the day, I think governments will need to step up, the resourcing both domestically as well as part of the wider international cooperation imperatives. I feel that the donor countries as well need to think about how we can support more gender inclusive climate action overall. And so those were some of the reflections that I had, and I'm really looking forward to this continuing conversation and to being in touch with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Nandi, for sharing your insights and your views on the compounded effects of the care crisis, climate crisis, and the challenges to sustainable development. And you have put on a range of solutions, economic solutions, social solutions on the table for consideration. And we're also delighted to hear that the Gates Foundation has embarked on some very important initiatives in this regard. Thank you, Ms. Nandi. Now, let me turn to our third panelist, Ms. Nolene Nabulivo. She is the Executive Director of Diverse Voices and Action for Equality. Ms. Nabulivo is a feminist organizer, educator, activist, policy analyst, and advocate. She has worked for justice and universal human rights in Fiji and the Pacific and globally for over 35 years. She works in urban poor, rural, and maritime communities in multilateral processes and as part of many social movements. Now, the questions I have for you, Ms. Naplivu, is what, in your view, the key interlinkages between gender equality and climate justice? And what do you perceive as the crucial impacts of climate change and environment and disaster issues on women, young people, older persons, and people of diverse gender identity? Going forward, how can we ensure that their voices are heard? Also, how do you think governments, international organizations, and the civil society can act to protect the fundamental human rights of women and girls, including addressing the gender impact of environmental issues, sexual and reproductive health, and gender-based violence? You are invited to also bring your work at DIVA as an example in this regard. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Chair. Government reps, development workers, civil society, social movement friends, all protocols observed. I really wanted to start by saying, I think it's advisable always to speak the politics from the personal, from embodied knowledge, because it allows us to really kind of look at the urgency and the depth and the scope of really complex issues like gender and climate justice. So, it's 8th of February, 2022, and so many people in Fiji are exhausted already just this year, some more than others. In just 1 month, for instance, in January, we endured nearly 4 full weeks of heavy rain in Nandi, flooding of houses endlessly. We experienced a cyclone. There's been 2 tropical disturbances passing by and a volcano eruption in Tonga that really took over all our lives in the Pacific, including here, and our mental health, affected our mental health. The temperature rise is really inexorable. We see the shifts. Water and electricity systems fail temporarily, but it's very tough. A poor woman in a maritime island area and a poor woman in an informal settlement are not always concerning themselves with the exact same problems, but both matter, both are full rights bearers. And you can have the debate about what is poverty and not, but if you can't fulfill the basic needs of your family in the middle of a crisis, and we're not quibbling about whether it's poor by income standard or poor by lack of opportunity, you're poor and it hurts. So for poor people, which are over 99% of the constituency network with which I work and live, there's now no way to be sufficiently resilient to withstand the loss and damage of this extent over and over, because it feels like an assault. Malnutrition is rising. DIVA and other NGOs with government ministries struggle every day to fill growing need, along with the usual development issues that we have to face in a small island state. Fellow staff can't go to work because of flooding, stops them moving from office to home. Shop stock is ruined, people postponing weddings. Sometimes bodies lie in morgues waiting for a dry day to bury a dead child, for instance. After 3 days, the morgue charges. Also, this week, children waited 2 years to sit exams, and now they're told they have to wait another week with just a couple of days' notice. Fiji Women's Crisis Center tells us that the violence rates are up hugely, but also that, for instance, nurses, our care economy that we just heard about, many nurses are being tormented by husbands and partners due to long hours away for work shifts that they're doing for community, often in patriarchal homes where the highest care tasks are done by women, unpaid care, domestic, and we always add and communal work as well, because of that whole set of wider community work that's done by women, LGBTQI people and others. And the exploitative wages, minimum wages, everyone knows that so many people are out of work. So for a lot of people, they're not even getting minimum wage now. And people are desperate and they ring and message us by the hour. And just a last little one that really brings together that this is about socioeconomic and ecological justice. An older lesbian woman can't move from her small rental on a riverbank. She's locked into the floodplain because she has an inability to afford even the next rank of rentals. And she has no family link. She lost those decades ago. She has her lino sitting up on the shelf. She brings it down only for a few hours every few days, but only after backbreaking work every single time to clean the small room and the precious possessions she has. She's mentally drained. We're mentally drained by taking care of some of those issues, and everyone is trying to do the best they can. So let's be clear on three things. We can't achieve gender equality, indeed any aspect of justice and equity, without looking at socioeconomic, ecological, and climate justice. It's a complete and linked framework of justice and human rights, and never possible without justice in all. The second point is that on every single front, we're failing to stop climate change and ecological damage onto ourselves, to other species, and the biosphere. And the UN Secretary General, in his report, paragraph 5, really usefully summarizes the extent that human influence has unequivocally warmed the atmosphere, oceans, and land, while climate change exacerbates poverty and inequalities, in particular those relating to gender, age, race, class, caste, indigenous status, migration status, and disability. And I would add sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression, putting at risk all human and non-human life on Earth. So when the stakes are this high, when our own species is at risk of extinction and other 200 other species every day, 1,000 times the pre-industrial rates, are becoming extinct, 70% of rainforests gone, 90% of coral reefs under threat, 30 to 50% of all species likely gone by 2050. We cannot possibly work on social and gender equity without working on climate, economic, and ecological justice. And so all multilateral efforts have to reflect this reality. At CSW66, we have the most valuable opportunity, but we have to do it every year and in every space, every multilateral space. And third, a critical understanding is that climate change affects everyone, but as I said, never equally. We experience all our rights in one body, and that's why every single body has to have autonomy and integrity in order to be able to experience justice. Really, the saying, leave no one behind, literally means that. This is why we have to use intersectionality and interlinkage frames to address gender and to address climate. If you're beaten by your husband or partner, if you have no economic power, if you live in a maritime area and can't reach state services, if you are a certain age or sexual orientation or a sex worker, if you're not treated as equal citizens because you're a Dalit woman or you're discriminated against by police as a dark-skinned woman in a majority white environment, under all those conditions, gender and climate justice is not achievable. So all these privileges and oppressions by accident of birth, by your context, your location, by your experience of climate change and disasters, are what matter. And to be frank, we are not, our states and our societies are not yet up to that challenge. That's why we're sitting here discussing this and why we need CSW66. Too many of us are trying to keep in our systems and in our own bodies the archaic systems of racist heteropatriarchy and radical capitalism in place. And that's the real reason we're failing. So on the issue of human rights and climate justice, there are many strategies and tactics. We've articulated these clearly for decades. We see them at COPs, we see them at CSW66 every year for over 25 years, and in national legislature and policies. The ideas and the frameworks are here, but what's not advanced enough is the political will to break and to build continually over time and with purpose in order to realize these new just, ecological, sound visions. And industrialized countries, therefore, if we're talking about what we call, I never call them developed, but industrialized governments, they have to confront and move away from eco-imperialism, an economic system that promotes and constrains resource production and consumption in poor countries, keeping us in poverty in order to divert resources to corporations and elites. Developing countries, we need to stop protecting these carbon majors. We have to insist on historical responsibility and common but differentiated responses. We have to make sure that the overall policies of G77 and China are about human rights and development justice and South-South cooperation, and not just about another kind of set of inequalities within ourselves as South states. So as highlighted by the COVID-19 pandemic and these continual cycles of loss and damage we are currently facing around the world, we need urgent, comprehensive, whole of society approaches that are promoted by intersectional movements. And those are both within governments and beyond governments, because we need to really not just ignite these, but really operationalize now those pathways to combat all of these inequalities. there's many things we can do and are doing. Feminist social movements are really trying hard to be part of all the other sets of work that governments and everyone are doing. We've articulated it in processes like the CSW66 expert group meeting. There's a report out of that, and the Women's Rights Caucus to CSW66. And I'll run through those very quickly in my second set of comments in brief, if that's all right. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Nolin, for your eloquent interventions. You have really brought us that strong sense of urgency. We must act now to tackle the climate crisis. But climate justice goes hand in hand in dealing with gender justice. And you highlighted the importance of supporting and empowering vulnerable groups and marginalized groups in this context. A lot of messages for us to digest in a short while. Now, I would like to give all of our panelists, 3 of you, each 1 minute to do a final reflection. I have 2 suggestions you may reflect on. What makes you hopeful that incorporating a gender lens into climate action within Asia and the Pacific so that it can be realized and achieved within the near future? Or if you prefer, you can also reflect on the comments, interventions from other panelists. May I first invite Mr. Akhbata to give your reflection? Are you ready?
Yep.
1 minute, please.
Yep. Yeah, really good presentations from the panelists. Yeah, especially from the Fiji. Well, it's what's quite informative, and I'll never expect such situation happening in the Fiji right now. Well, I completely agree with Ms. Nomadin on the handling the incorporating the gender lens into climate action, so that Asia Pacific will benefit the mostly compared to the other part of the world. Well, that's all for me.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Ms. Nandi. Would you also like to share a quick reflection?
Thanks, Chai Chai. I think what makes me hopeful is there are more than 200 people on this call listening to this conversation. So clearly people care about the issues. I think what also makes me hopeful, as I mentioned earlier, is the coming together of very different partners on the same table with their different strengths and capacities to solve for this problem. And I hope we can continue that, like in the post-generation equality forum world. I hope we can continue to keep that momentum up. And I think there was some comment, question around the institutional challenges. I think for me, the 2 critical gaps that we need to address urgently, which I mentioned earlier, but I will repeat for the sake of, for everyone, is the voice and representation of those most affected to be at the heart of any policy discussion. I think we cannot just talk inclusion, we have to practice it. That's one. And the second, I think, is really the capacity, the institutional capacity and resources. It would be great if member states can also reflect on, where their own needs are and, capacity support is required, because that's where the rest of us can also come in and, help out. So those are some of my suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Nandi. Noli, could you also share your reflection?
Sure. So the first thing I just say very briefly is the idea that it's possible to do this work on gender and climate change without adequate climate finance is really hard to hear, right? The idea that we can look after our communities wherever we are and be resilient without a global agreement on loss and damage, that's impossible. That's why we're working so hard at COP26 and 27 and with over 100 countries now to get that in place, a facility. And then what's really needed is also we need to challenge the dominant, economic and development models, but really to do it from a very specific substantive place. So that's doing things like recognizing and redressing loss and damage, peace and human security, looking really at transformative economic justice. What does a human rights-based approach to climate action actually look like? How do we incorporate SRHR into every single sector of our development justice work? How do we address these long-standing issues like the sovereign debt crisis, to ensure that countries have that fiscal space where they can do the work on gender equality and climate action? How do we think about things like the false solutions that are being put forward? This emphasis on throwing the ball forward, the net zero and nature-based solutions, when we really need the urgent mitigation cuts now, if we're going to survive. And one of the things that makes me hopeful is that we have things in place in many, many places. It's the political will to get that into place and the resourcing. What we really require is the resourcing. We have the UNFPA Gender Action Plan, the Enhanced Lima Work Program on Gender. And I wanted to just add the gender and climate change national focal points. They're now in place in 90 countries, which is a great thing. But for instance, unfortunately, there's not one in a Pacific small island state. So that's another set of, linked work. I would say also the issue around local communities and indigenous peoples feeling really engaged on the sets of work, on all sets of work, whether they're mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, technology, talking about technology as development and not just transfer, so that it's not commodifying climate solutions. And the last thing I'd say is we really need to talk about why we're not getting the breakthroughs on financing, because it's clear that the problem actually isn't lack of money, it's where the money is being prioritized. So for instance, okay, we celebrate, a renewed 2023 commitment by carbon majors, but it was due in 2020 at an agreed minimum. We decided on that together as people around the world. So will it be the full figure that we see now, or again, will we be waiting the whole time? And I wanted to say, when we had COVID-19, we saw that governments were able to raise $9,000 billion, and how quickly that was delivered to corporations in 2020 to Feb 2021. So if it can be done for that, it can be done for the loss and damage facility. So that's really my final call. If CSW66 is to mean something, it is that it will substantively help us to mitigate, to adapt, and to work through the enormous daily work of loss and damage. Thank you.
Thank you, Nolin. I would like to thank all of our panelists as well as Dr. Akhtar for your insightful interventions. In a short time, you have brought to us the gender impacts of climate issues from various angles with strong evidence and possible solutions to address the challenges we are facing. So this concludes the panel interventions for this session. We will now begin the plenary discussions, which will run for about 45 minutes. May I please remind our participants that the outcome of this consultation will be a set of recommendations on areas of for accelerated action in line with the priority theme for CSW66. And the set of recommendations will be informed by 3 substantive sessions, including this first session. In the plenary discussions, government representatives are invited to share their experiences and perspectives. This will be followed by perspectives from other stakeholders. As we would like to hear from as many stakeholders as possible, we ask that all interventions please be kept to no more than 2 minutes. We have a clock on the screen to assist us with the timekeeping. In the guidance notes for participants that was circulated in advance of this meeting, we invited expression of interest to intervene. We have accepted these on a rolling basis in the order of receipt by the Secretariat. I also invite you to request for the floor using the chat box, listing the request to speak together with your full name, country, or organization. Raising your hand in Zoom will not register your request to speak. This is just to help us to track who raised the hands first, given the large number of participants. So we will only accept 1 intervention per country or per organization under each agenda item. And that intervention will be invited, and the interventions will be first invited by government representatives, and then chronologically as per request received in the chat box. So we now I open the floor for government representatives. We received prior to the meeting a few requests from governments. So I will call on these governments first before we go to the request from the chat box. On my list, I'd like to first invite Mr. Ke Yongsheng, permanent representative of China to ESCAP, followed by Ms. Harith, additional secretary from Sri Lanka. First, Mr. Ke, the floor is yours. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Chai, the moderator. I also would like to, ladies and gentlemen, take this opportunity to express my appreciation to the views shared by all the panelists. In 1995, the Fourth World Conference on Women was successfully held in Beijing and adopted the Beijing Declaration and a platform for action. 27 years on, the spirit championed by the Beijing Conference had catalyzed positive changes, and the status of women has been significantly improved. However, in the same time, climate change, intervened with the raging pandemic, is bringing new challenges to gender equality, as expressed by some of the panelists. China highly values the importance of climate change in response. In 2020, Chinese President Xi Jinping solemnly announced that China would strive to achieve the peak of carbon emissions by 2030 and the carbon neutrality by 2060. In concrete actions, we adopt a new development philosophy that pursues green development. We rose above green challenges and delivered on our 2020 climate action target 2 years ahead of schedule. Besides, China actively promotes international cooperation on climate change. In 2021, China and 28 other countries launched the initiative for Belt and Road Partnership on Green Development. In recent years, China has allocated about 1.1 billion RMB for South-South climate cooperation. China actively promotes the empowerment of women and girls and put in place a legal system comprising over 100 laws and regulations for full protection of women's and girls' rights and interests. China is recognized by the World Health Organization as one of the 10 fast-track countries in women's and children's health. In China, the gender gap in compulsory education has been largely closed. The female account for over 40% of the country's workforce. China is also a champion of girls' development globally. In recent years, China has helped developing countries implement 100 maternal and child health projects and has trained 130,000 female professionals. In the coming 5 years, China will donate another $10 million to UN Women to advance the empowerment of women and girls. In particular, China attaches great importance to the protection of rights and interests for women and girls during its campaign on climate change. In the outline of women's development in China 2021 to 2030, women and the environment is listed as one of the priorities. China's national climate change adaptation strategy places clear priority on improving climate adaptation for vulnerable groups, including women. Women's needs are taken into consideration in storage and distribution of disaster relief supplies. Ladies and gentlemen, in face of the serious challenges posed by climate change and related disasters, we need to pay extra attention to the special needs of women and girls. First, we need to strengthen women and girls' adaptation to climate change. Development should be put as a priority to help more women and girls out of poverty and achieve economic autonomy so as to guarantee stronger capacity and resilience against climate-related disasters for women and girls. Last year, President Xi Jinping put forward the Global Development Initiative. Recently, China has launched a group of Friends of the Global Development Initiative at the UN headquarters in New York. This initiative aims to advance the implementation of the 2030 Agenda and global development, and will inject strong impetus to equal rights for women and girls. We invite all parties to join the initiative and a group of friends to advance the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. Second, we need to advance gender mainstreaming in climate change response. Women's development should be put higher on the agenda of regional cooperation so as to make women-related targets early harvest result of the 2030 Agenda. Third, we need to eliminate deep-rooted prejudice, discrimination, and violence against women and girls, and address new challenges such as gender digital divide. Protection of women and girls' rights and interests should be incorporated into the national development plan and policy. Ladies and gentlemen, as is often said in China, women hold up half of the sky. We hope all parties in Asia and the Pacific could step up cooperation to promote the empowerment of women and girls and support women's role of holding up half of the sky in regional cooperation on climate change and disaster risk reduction. Let's join hands and build an equal, green, and resilient future with the participation of women and girls. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ke, for your intervention. I was just informed by our technical team that due to technical constraints, the camera has been disabled for the intervention from the floor due to the large number of participants in this meeting. Apologies that we will be able to enable sound only for the interventions. Now, I'd like to call on Ms. Harath, Additional Secretary from the State Ministry of Women and Child Development, Preschool and Primary Education School Infrastructure and Education Services, Sri Lanka, followed by Ms. Sofinas Hassan from Republic of Maldives. Over to you, Ms. Harath.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm from Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is having a range of policies as well as good structures in place with an extensive outreach to the ground level for managing disaster and reducing disaster risks. It is also acknowledged that there are gendered impact of climate change, environmental degradation and disaster risk reduction, which is why the Sri Lankan government took action to formulate a 5-year national action plan to address sexual gender-based violence, in which there is a full sectoral plan on addressing sexual gender-based violence in situation of disasters in Sri Lanka. It included numerous strategies based on 3 types of approach, such as prevention, intervention, and policy advocacy. When its impact was reviewed at the end of its 5 years of implementation, it is a pleasure to say that the understanding and sensitivity towards gender responsive disaster management and need to be vigilant on SGBV during the disasters were much improved among the public. Then in 2017, a special program called Liyasahana was conducted to revitalize the disturbed livelihood of the women victims of flood by spending 77 million rupees of immediate allocated government funds. Also, awareness programs are being conducted to raise awareness on minimizing the impact on women and children at risk in times of disasters like floods and droughts. Moreover, an institution under this ministry, it is Sri Lanka Women's Bureau, has implemented a special program in collaboration with JICA with the aim of providing aids to the business women whose businesses have been badly affected by the present huge medical disaster of COVID-19. Apart from these, there are 12,542 women's organizations functioning under this Ministry of Women and Child Development. These women's work organization allocate an annual allocation for climate-friendly small and medium enterprises development. However, I would like to suggest that although sustainable mechanisms, structures, and guidelines are in place to handle GBV during disasters, better coordination, referral and intervention, and psychosocial support mechanism should also be in place to encounter the negative impact on women through climate changes and other disaster risks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your intervention. Now, may I call on our next speaker, Ms. Sofinas Hassan, Secretary General, National Disaster Management Authority from Republic of Maldives, followed by Ms. Hope Paisley from Australia. Ms. Hassan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Very good morning from Maldives to all distinguished participants. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Consequences of climate change can be felt in the short term through natural hazards. In the Maldives, the intensity and severity of hydrometeorological hazards, be it monsoonal rain, tropical storms, or storm surges, has increased in the past few years. The adverse impacts of the changing climate is felt across many aspects of the island community life, including in relation to agriculture, water security, and biodiversity. Like the trend we see everywhere in the world, the women in the Maldives are more vulnerable to these impacts of climate change than men. In many instances, women are the key family member that stays back in the house to take care of the household. She is also the main person that organizes home-based economic activities for her independence and as a means for extra income to the family. These home-based activities include agriculture, fish, and seafood processing. If we look at the damage and loss data statistics from the Maldives, we know that these activities are disrupted after each major flooding event in the islands. Locally grown produce are sometimes completely lost before the crops can be harvested. Equipment used for manufacturing and home-based processing are damaged or washed off due to floodwaters in many instances. The economic losses caused due to disruption of home-based activities are rarely accounted. Due to this, the coping capacities of women, especially women-led households, are limited compared to those of working men. Women's voices are also rarely heard when developing island-level developmental plans. Take it all into account, it is important that we still try to make our policies more gender sensitive across all sectors. Even if recovery policies are in place, each emergency or disaster which we are facing is unique, and existing policies may need to be tailored to appropriately respond to different needs. Mainstreaming gender in DRR is key, since Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction advocates for people-centered approach to disaster risks. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you for your intervention. I'd like to remind all speakers to limit your interventions to 2 minutes only in view of a large number of participants who are requesting the floor. Now, I'd like to give the floor to Ms. Hope Paisley, Assistant Secretary, Safety and International Branch, Office for Women, Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, Australia. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ms. Chai. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm meeting on today and pay my respects to all leaders past, present and emerging. We have today all highlighted the disproportionate adverse effects of climate change, environmental degradation and disasters on women and girls. In our region, we know that 95% of deaths in the Solomon Islands, 2014 floods, were women. And 55% of deaths in the 2015 earthquake in Nepal were women. This kind of gender disaggregated data empowers us to transform how we build resilience and respond to disasters. In 2022, we know that COVID-19 is exacerbating violence and insecurity, restricting mobility and generating additional domestic and work responsibilities for women. Domestic economic data highlights that women have lost work in higher numbers than men, and surveys show lockdown restrictions have led to more domestic violence. At a global level, these are significant gaps in gender disaggregated data and analysis. This lack of information potentially undermines effort to build resilience and respond to disaster. Australia is pleased to support the Women's International Network on Disaster Risk Reduction, which promotes women's leadership in disaster risk reduction in the Indo-Pacific. Domestically, Australia has committed to 3.7 million to training for frontline responders to help to support women and girls who are experiencing domestic violence during natural disasters and recovery efforts. Today's discussion will deepen our understanding of the gendered impacts of climate change, environmental degradation and disasters, and ensure we can continue to contribute to outcomes on the Commission at the Status of Women meeting next month. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your intervention and keeping to the time. Now, the next request on my list is from Ms. AKM Shamin Akhtar, Additional Secretary, Minister of Women and Children's Affairs, Bangladesh, followed by request from Uzbekistan, Casanova Diofuza. First, Ms. Akhtar, please.
Thank you, Chair. This is Mr. Sorry for that.
Mr. Akhtar.
Yeah. Respected
Apologies.
Chair, yes, I'm starting. Respected Chair, Bangladesh economy is growing faster in spite of high population and frequent natural disaster. It is projected that financial loss due to climate change will be exceeding our annual growth rate within this decade. Therefore, it will be difficult to fulfill national and international commitment regarding gender issues in near future. Few of the impacts we are facing are now unpredictable pattern of environment, increasing of poverty, enhancement of burden of unpaid care work, difficulties of safe drinking water, changing of crop pattern, increasing internal migration, street children, etc., burden on planned urbanization, displacement of house and infrastructural damage, increasing violence against women, child marriage, and so on. Needless to say, women are the most affected. In order to address these, some of the good practices are introduction of gender responsive budgeting, and as well as climate change budgeting system in our budgetary system, and also determining the 3 key areas in budgetary system, such as poverty alleviation, women empowerment, and climate change. Some of the related policy prioritizing women's benefits are Bangladesh Delta Plan 2100, National Women Development Policy, Bangladesh Climate Change and Gender Action Plan, Bangladesh Perspective Plan up to 2041, and so on. Mujib Climate Prosperity Decade 2030. Some of the notable programs are like a project to enhancing adaptive capacities of coastal communities, especially women. Another program to strengthen climate change and disaster management structure for gender responsive disaster management. There is also social safety net program to support most vulnerable women around the country. Respected Chair, we can focus on some key points, which could be: number 1, develop a framework for embed a gender lens in climate investment projects. Number 2, international community need to provide financial, technical, and technological resources to achieve climate and gender-related SDGs goal. Number 3, proper importance on psychosocial assistance for women after any disaster and adverse impact of climate change. Number 4, principle of equity. I repeat, principle of equity. Could international get preference for any kind of international assistance for the worst affected countries? Number 5, investment should be enhanced to combat violence against women and green economy, etc. Thank you, moderator.
Thank you for your intervention, Mr. Akhtar. Now let me turn to Uzbekistan. Kasanova Dilfiza, Ministry of Health, Department of Women and Children and Healthcare. The floor is yours.
Good morning, dear participants in this Congress. I am glad to see you and to listen to you. I speak English very terrible, but I will speak that in Uzbekistan there are two laws about gender and woman gender. We did very more. If you let me speak Russian.
Apologies, for this meeting, we don't have Russian translation. Maybe you can send your statement to us. Would that be okay?
Unfortunately, в Узбекистане принято два закона по гендерному равенству и по противодействию гендерному насилию над женщинами и детьми. Проведены очень много мероприятий по обучению представителей услуг, психологических услуг, медицинских услуг, правоохранительных услуг. И на сегодняшний день разработаны стандартные операционные процедуры предоставления услуг по жертвам гендерного насилия в плане психологической поддержки, медицинской поддержки и правовой поддержки женщин. Я очень рада, что участвую на вашей конференции и надеюсь на ваше понимание. Спасибо. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Dilfuza from Uzbekistan. Now there's a final request in my list of government's request. His Excellency, Mr. Joachim Jose Gusmão dos Reis Martins, Secretary of State for Civil Protection, Timor-Leste. The floor is yours.
All right, first of all, I would like to begin by extending appreciation for the invitation to Timor-Leste to participate in the Asia-Pacific Regional Consultation on Priority Theme of the 66th session of the Commission on the Status of Women. It is indeed a great pleasure for me, the Secretary of State for Civil Protection, Timor-Leste, to be here amongst His Excellency, Member State, and all distinguished participants from various entities to attend the proposed event. Being a sovereign country that is located among Southeast Asia and the Pacific, Timor-Leste is one of the vulnerable nations that has tangible impact due to climate-related and other disasters. Timor-Leste is ranked as a 15 amongst 181 countries, as one of the countries exposed to highest risk of disaster. The experience has shown us a tough lesson during natural disaster that Timor-Leste 2 years consecutively, 2020 and 2021. Severe inundation on the 4th of April 2021 has caused 33,835 affected families in total, and 41 people lost their life. The government of Timor-Leste understands that the most vulnerable groups, including women, children, people with disabilities, and elderly, are disproportionately affected by the disaster. Amongst the flood-affected population in 2021 April flood, an estimated 48%, almost half, are girls and women. The post-disaster needs assessment of the 2021 April floods highlighted that disaster in the context of COVID-19 has exacerbated the pre-existing deep-rooted intersection of gender and social inequality in Timor-Leste. It brought massive impact to every aspect of girls and women's lives, including livelihood, education, food security, and nutrition. The government stands ready to strengthen gender-responsive disaster preparedness and response which take into consideration diverse needs of girls, women, people with disabilities, and other vulnerable groups in the future disaster preparedness. The local communities are vulnerable to the impact of climate variability and change. And in particular, girls and women are one of the vulnerable groups who are the most adversely affected. 56% of employed women work in agriculture Timor-Leste. Climate change has a devastating impact on agriculture production, livelihood, and food security, as well as malnutrition. The government stays committed to ensure the protection of the rights of girls and women in disaster response, as well as the response to climate change. Aside to the above-mentioned climate change-induced disaster, the government of Timor-Leste is also in partnership with UN Women adopting National Action Plan 1325 that currently on the second phase of implementation. Another focus of the second phase National Action Plan 1325 is that more protection for women and girls, including women, participate in decision-making for the wellness and well-being post-disaster. As such, on behalf of the government of Timor-Leste, under the Secretary of State for Transportation, I will certainly fully support for a recommendation that will fit the CSW66 and membership contribution to the agreed conclusion. Thank you all for the attention, and I wish you all very best of success to address intersectionality of gender equality, climate change, environment, and disaster risk reduction and management. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your interventions. We have now exhausted the request from governments. Let me turn to requests from non-governmental stakeholders. First, the first two on my list is Ms. Chris Ryder, Regional Migration, Environment and Climate Change Specialist from Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific International Organization for Migration, IOM, followed by Ms. Sarah Batuli from Egypt, National Expert and Green Building and Climate Resilience. First, Mr. Chris, please.
Thank you very much, colleagues. For IOM, discussions on the gendered impacts of climate change, environmental degradation, and disasters induced by natural hazards must also address connections with human mobility. This is critical since human mobility, migration, displacement, and planned relocation will increasingly occur in the context of climate change and environmental degradation with varying gendered implications. It can increase individuals' vulnerabilities, or it can be a positive adaptation strategy that enhances opportunities for inclusive growth and sustainable development. For example, migration caused by climate and environmental change can exacerbate pre-existing inequalities, intensifying in particular the gender-specific dimensions of discrimination and poverty. In the context of disasters, the number of dead and injured is higher among women whose mobility is limited by the socio-cultural context. Women and children also more pronouncedly suffer the social consequences of crisis situations and can become vulnerable to additional forms of violence and discrimination. This is particularly concerning in the Asia-Pacific region, where gender-based violence rates overall are high, especially in the Pacific Island countries. On the other hand, migration can also lead to positive changes, including in the roles attributed to women, and can strengthen their financial independence, household autonomy, and decision-making power, and their contribution to the economy. It is therefore necessary to also promote the positive opportunities offered by migration, such as education and economic independence, to support individuals' empowerment. Much depends, however, on the enabling conditions in place, including the socio-economic and environmental dynamics at play, individual characteristics and circumstances, the nature of the migration process, and the policies in place at the national, regional, and global levels. Gender-specific analysis of migration and its interactions with climate and environmental factors is therefore important to understanding the specific roles played by women and men in their socio-cultural contexts, and to better discern the different ways in which they are affected by climate and environmental events. It is also important to incorporate a human mobility perspective from the outset of any efforts to assess the impacts of climate change on development, including its gender dimensions. Looking ahead to this year's CSW, IOM hopes that the outcomes will include two important recommendations. First, to highlight the need to assess human mobility and its connections with gender, climate change, and other environmental factors. And second, to draw linkages with other ongoing processes to which these issues are relevant, including the International Migration Review Forum, the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction 2022, and COP27. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for your intervention. Next, I would like to invite Ms. Sarah Batuti from Egypt, followed by Ms. Mrinalini Roy from Women for Biodiversity. Mrs. Sarah Batuti first.
Hello?
Yes.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes,
Hi.
please.
Good morning. I wanted to raise just an issue that I hope comes into the policy that we are discussing today. And I'd like to talk about, there's a huge gap in jobs, in women having jobs that actually formulate the solutions to climate mitigation and adaptation. As an engineer myself, there seems to be a growing disparity for women working in energy, in biology, in science, and in engineering and infrastructure. There are more women working on the research end, which means that they have this embedded knowledge. And then you receive less women actually getting the jobs in the future that with this embedded knowledge not being utilized very well. At the rate we're going, we're seeing more discussions about complex sciences, engineering, product development, solutions and everything. And we are seeing less and less women involved in the implementation of these solutions, in the design, whereas they are the most in need for these kind of services and solutions and products to be in place. There's a huge disparity there because women are falling out of the education system. Less women are in STEM, in developing nations. Less women are working on coding. There is a systemic sort of alienation of women becoming part of the solution and actually having the power and being empowered to be there in designing these solutions, in owning these companies, in becoming the young entrepreneurs to resolve these solutions across the spectrum. And this we are seeing right at the beginning of when they start their career and their speciality, because less women entrepreneurs are coming in, they're being restricted to the household, they are being restricted as young activists, etc., and they're not getting these opportunities. And I think the discussion needs to really include where are women in the future jobs that are dominated by men, these jobs that are high tech, these jobs that need to be translated into having women are the ones implementing it, designing the products for other women to use across the income stratas and to use across various cultures as well. It's not enough. The discussion is not happening in any part of the world where we are seeing at the table, out of every 50 men in cooling, in chemical fertilizers, in energy, in all of these solutions, women are not present on the table, and we need to push that they are present through there, and we need to work on that from the beginning of their education. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your intervention. Next on my list is representative from Women for Biodiversity, Mrinalini Rai. Ms. Rai, please.
Thank you very much. I hope everybody can hear me. It's wonderful to be here and part of the Asia Pacific consultation in preparation for the CSW. Just bringing an attention on the meeting, I also wanted to take the space to also bring the significance of the roles that women play in biodiversity conservation. Women contribute significantly in all spheres of biodiversity conservation, sustainable use, and management of natural resources. However, many studies show how women are often on the margins and their roles and work often gets under-recognized or are hidden in other sectors. The role of men and women are often gendered, and the way they manage resources are different. In certain situations, gender disparities in land and natural resource access, control, and ownership, as well as systemic social, cultural impediments to women's economic prospects can make more women reliant on local access to nature and more vulnerable to environmental degradation. So this is really very important that as we look at this preparation, that the recommendation that hopefully goes off from here is also look at the role that women play in the biodiversity, in the environment sector, that also is a basis for the climate and also for disaster. So they all three sectors, or the key pillars for living in harmony with nature, should be looked at each other in a package. As CSW66 begins in New York, the parallel CBD post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is also taking place in March. And in that, it will be really very important that some of the gender considerations from the CSW could also inform that process to ensure that the Global Biodiversity Framework that is being discussed also includes some of these recommendations. I have my statement, and because of the time, I will submit it, and hopefully people would be able to take reference, and I will also post it in the chat. So thank you very much.
Thank you for your intervention. The final request on my list is the representative from Arrow. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I am Biplavi, representing Asia Pacific Resource and Research Center for Women, Arrow. Asia and the Pacific, as we all know, the region is at the forefront of experiencing the impact of climate change and its related disasters. Studies by Arrow and our partners in the region has also revealed that the impacts of climate change are not gender neutral, as also have been spoken by our panelists today. And these harsh realities, inequalities faced by women and girls in all their diversities are further amplified during climate disasters. And not to mention sexual and reproductive health and rights gets further deteriorated due to the deprioritization in the context of humanitarian crisis. And it is largely missing in the environment and climate discourses. Access to sexual and reproductive health services, including contraceptives, safe abortion services, comprehensive sexuality education, they are limited despite the need. And this is seen during the COVID-19 pandemic when priorities were also shifted. And the gender-specific need of women and girls in all their diversities to adapt and build their resilience to climate change disasters were deprioritized. So we therefore call on our member states, as we also discussed the agreed conclusions, to take immediate concrete measures to address the issues on the nexus between gender equality and the climate change, with a focus on sexual and reproductive health and rights for progressive, inclusive, and gender responsive policies, financing, and implementation at all. We also recommend that there's a recognition, there should be a recognition that gender equality and women's empowerment are central to development, environmental sustainability and achievement of SDGs, as well as Beijing and ICPD. And also there's a need that the member states uphold sexual and reproductive health and rights and acknowledge its co-benefits in contributing to climate adaptation, mitigation, and resilience. Thank you.
Thank you for your intervention. This is the final request on my list, and in view of time, we will not go into further discussion because we have two more substantive discussions which will go into very detailed examination of policies, program solutions, as well as how to put women at the center of climate action. I want to express appreciation to all the panelists and the countries, as well as the CSO and the UN partners for your contribution. You have highlighted challenges and the issues we needed to look into in the context of environment, climate change, and disaster risks, and even proposed initial solutions we need to look into. We'll go into further discussion in the next two sessions. With that, I'm bringing this session to a close. I will also mention that the comments you have put in the chat box, we will review them and draw from them for shaping the recommendation. So the summary of recommendation from each session, including this one, will be presented by session co-leads from the UN system during the final session tomorrow. And during that session, the final session, comments on the draft recommendations will be welcomed, and the meeting report, including the recommendations, will be shared with all participants after the meeting. We will now take a break, but before we take the short break, let me invite the MC to make an announcement.
Thank you very much, Ms. Chai Chai, and thank you to all of our panelists once again for your insights, and to all of the participants as well who delivered remarks during the plenary discussion. This is just to inform you that we are almost on schedule, and we will now take a short break before returning for our second session at 11:35 local Thailand time. So we have a 5-minute break now, and we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we will now commence our second session on regional and national gender transformative policies on climate change, environment, and disaster risk reduction. I would like to introduce the moderator for our second session, Ms. Sylvia Lehel, Gender and Climate Finance Specialist at the Bangkok Regional Hub of the United Nations Development Programme. Ms. Lehel has over 10 years of experience working on the intersection of gender and environment and climate change. Ms. Lehel, please, the floor is yours.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome to you to the second session. Thank you for the lovely introduction. It is my pleasure to introduce the theme of the second session, which will be focusing on regional and national gender transformative policies on climate change, environment, and disaster risk reduction. In this session, we will aim to showcase a regional overview and receive country-level good practices to identify opportunities for translating policies and actions into a shared vision towards a low-carbon, resilient, just, and sustainable future. As you will see, the gender parity in national environmental decision-making is still scarce, and the employees, for instance, of environmental ministries are on average still very much underrepresented when it comes to gender parity. Only 1/3 of them are women. And although there's a gender balance in government delegations to climate negotiations, it is on the rise, it's still obvious that it is still a male-dominated arena. According to the UNFPA research, men spoke at 74% in plenary meetings, and this needs to be improved to enable the voice of women. Similarly, globally, only 25% of parliamentarians are women, and only 23% of countries in the Asia-Pacific region have a gender-inclusive process in coordination mechanisms related to climate change and the environment. So it is very important to incorporate the gender machinery in these processes, as we will hear from our presenters as well. When it comes to climate finance, the gaps are also persisting. According to the OECD, only 1.5% of climate-related ODA identifies gender equality as a primary objective. And what is even more alarming, only 0.2% reaches women-led and women's grassroots organizations. So we really need to work to make this the resources of gender responsive climate finance accessible. When it comes to the desired achievement of green growth and sustainable recovery, we also see some alarming issues. Green growth is not necessarily inclusive, and without specific policy interventions, women are less likely to benefit from the new job creations. Again, as it was mentioned by some of the panelists before, 80% of disaster-related displacements worldwide have occurred in the Asia-Pacific region, and the climate displacement also needs to be addressed by related policies. Next slide, please. When it comes to grafting some of these solutions and gender transformative responses, it is extremely important to take the representation of women in policy and decision-making very, very seriously in order to ensure the integration of women's knowledge and experience and develop collective solutions as we heard with a number of panelists and also with my fellow co-leads, some of the projects and programs of UN Women and UNDP are precisely working around these issues to make this just and climate resilience transition a possibility, and also the access to climate finance in a gender responsive manner. So we will have an opportunity to go into more depth about these issues during this session. And we will begin, just like in the first panel, with an introductory presentation, and then followed by a panel discussion. And then we will invite member countries and civil society to take the floor, which will be moderated by my colleague, Ms. Maria Holzberg. But now it is my great pleasure to introduce Ms. Saba Nordin, who will be providing the introductory presentation. And Ms. Nordin is a distinguished civil servant from the Maldives, and she's the President's Special Envoy for Climate Change in the President's Office of the Maldives. So Ms. Nordin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning from the Maldives, and thank you for inviting me to speak at this session. The Maldives has always been at the forefront of climate change. As a small island state lying just over 1.5 meters above sea level, we have been the picture of vulnerability in the face of the climate crisis for decades. Like many other developing countries, the Maldives is already facing the impacts of the climate emergency. We currently experience an increased intensity in storms and flooding, land loss, and erosion. As the IPCC AR6 report released last year clearly states, we will also face a further weakening of our foundational coral reef systems as global temperatures rise. This has direct and devastating consequences for our livelihoods, which are wholly dependent on the health of our natural ecosystems. Just as the climate crisis results in an intensification and increase in the frequency of storms and flooding, it also intensifies the structural injustices inherent in our systems. Across the world, and especially in the global south, this impact is unfortunately felt more by women. In developing countries, we face simultaneous challenges of ensuring access to basic services and fulfillment of developmental needs, while also ensuring these solutions are climate progressive and sustainable. All this with the added burden of a global pandemic and limited resources. It is therefore encouraging that advancing gender equality is a long-term and systematic solution that addresses all these challenges. Ensuring that women are an integral part of climate decision-making requires broader structural reforms. In preparing our Gender Equality Action Plan, we have noted that although we've had greater success in the health and education sectors, we have much to do in the areas of political and economic empowerment and access to justice. The Maldives has made some positive strides in this regard. For the first time in the history of the Maldives, we now have women justices in the Supreme Court and aim to increase the composition of women in the judiciary to 15%. In April 2021, the Maldives held local council elections under the amended Decentralization Act, which ensures that women make up 1/3 of the newly elected councils. 388 women councillors were elected last year. Along with greater financial independence and an increase in budget for the councils and their women's development committees, the number of women now in leadership and policy roles, especially at a local government level, has certainly increased. The hope is that with more women around the table, there will be a more accurate reflection of the issues facing local communities, which is then translated to more practical and progressive policies. But the election alone isn't enough. There is a recognition that traditional cultural or social ideas about gender pervade so heavily that in certain circumstances, it has meant a limitation in the roles these newly elected women leaders into very traditional gendered activities. A more concerted effort to raise awareness, increase the technical capacity of newly elected councillors, assistance with the formulation of work plans and land use plans are being implemented to overcome these challenges. In the Maldives and in many other developing countries, women are at the center of home-based economic activities. For instance, small-scale agriculture, fish processing, and with every flood, it is these activities that get disrupted. Frequent disasters also disrupt access to schooling and healthcare, again disproportionately impacting women who provide most of the caregiving services, unpaid caregiving services. What we have found difficult to do so far is the economic assessment of these losses. It is easier to value damage to hard infrastructure and furniture, but more challenging to value loss of crops and home-based economic activity, especially in a context where there is an unfamiliarity in providing the level of data needed for compensation schemes. Programs to create more awareness on DRR, which include assisting local communities to initiate basic emergency measures without waiting for the arrival of frontline responders, or tactics to increase the resilience of homes and properties against floods are being implemented. The establishment of water and sanitation systems on all inhabited islands is also a primary pledge of this administration, and one that we hope to complete by next year. Ensuring access to piped, safe water and proper sanitation systems is adaptation, and will decrease the burden on women. In addition, some of our water and sanitation and renewable energy programs mandate greater consultation with women in the local communities, appointment of gender focal points at utility services, and an active recruitment of women into these sectors. I would like to touch on one final point before I conclude. That is data. In preparation for this session, I went in search of data, specifically on how the climate crisis in the Maldives impacts women. What I found was a distinct gap. This was also the finding of a recent assessment of gender statistics carried out by UN Women and the Ministry of Gender, Family and Social Services. Not having access to timely data, and especially sex disaggregated data, is a significant disadvantage in policymaking. We have begun implementing some excellent policies in the Maldives, but we haven't been able to properly analyze the impact of these policies through a gender lens. Having this level of data allows the better honing of policies, budgeting, stronger communication on wider benefits to women and society, and a shift in mindsets where gender must be mainstreamed into all social and political considerations. The need to value women's voices and incorporate gender considerations into our national programs is one that requires a constant and consistent effort. I firmly believe investing in women and amplifying women's perspectives is an investment in climate resilience. With the technology that is now available and with innovative thinking, it is possible to ensure development gains while incorporating adaptation and climate resilience. I look forward to learning from the experiences of others around our region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Nordine, for your eloquent words and also the commendable efforts by the Maldives to tackle these multifaceted challenges. Before we move to our panel discussion, I would like all the presenters, our panelists, to turn on their cameras so that we can take a group photo for a moment. It's been done. We can move to our panel discussion, and I will introduce each panelist before their interventions. They will have 5 to 6 minutes to answer a first round of questions, and then we will have another round of quick feedbacks from our panelists. Our first intervention comes from Ms. Farah Kabir of Bangladesh. She is the country director of ActionAid in Bangladesh with several decades of impressive work on fighting for human rights and women's empowerment in Bangladesh. And it is my pleasure to pose the first question to her, which will be focusing on the role of CSOs. And I would like to find out from Ms. Kabir the experience of ActionAid in enabling a gender transformative action on the ground in the areas of climate change, disaster risk reduction, and the environment. And what are the priority policy areas to deliver and uphold a just and equitable and sustainable transition to a climate resilient development? Ms. Kabir, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everybody from Dhaka, and thank you, Sylvia. And that's a lot of, you've packed in a lot in that question. I have a couple of slides. I would like to take you through that. Can we have the next slide? But just to set the context that, you know, I took over the leadership of ActionAid Bangladesh in 2007. And my understanding that how disasters were impacting climate change, the community and the vulnerabilities and climate change is a reality came in the first 6 months of working here because of the multiple disasters that took place in the first 6 months and the vulnerability and its impact. So what my realization at that point was that however much we have invested in development, in bringing in changes in infrastructure, they can all disappear with the wink of an eye because of floods, because of cyclones. And Bangladesh is a lower riparian, and it is inundated often. Part of it is a blessing because it brings in, when the water comes, there's siltation and so on. But often it is also a disaster, and it impacts men, women, in different ways. And previous speakers have all said that the gender inequalities that already exist influence how different people experience and adapt to the impacts of climate change. And I want to share here again another example. There was a major cyclone in 2007 called Cyclone Sido, and the coastal areas were affected. Now, while we were working there as part of the humanitarian response and emergency, we were moving people to safer places. There were 127 sex workers. And in that existing context where everybody was vulnerable, the communities were suffering, they were flooded, there was need for water, food, this same society would not acknowledge or accept the sex workers to move in with them in the shelter. So the inherent existing mindset, social context, inequalities impact or add to the impacts of climate change, disaster, and environmental degradation. So I want to set that as the premise. And this is how it became very clear to us at ActionAid that we have to do a lot more work. And progress was being made in Bangladesh. We were able to advocate and influence policies, and strategies were developed. Amongst the set of stakeholders working on the issue of climate change, we felt that there were still gaps of understanding. I'm talking about from 2008. So if you take my journey, and it was important not just to influence the national actors, the political actors, the local actors, it was also about having these conversations with international actors and how it was impacting and what the gender dimension was. And we often talk about gender dimension and refer to women and girls, but what about this is why I brought in the reference to a marginalized community, the sex workers, but there's also people with different sexual orientation. Next slide, please. So at ActionAid, we took on we were working with emergencies. Now we took on a very strong concerted effort that we would discuss and work with the community. It has to be rooted there, understand. So our initiatives were around women-led emergency response. They are the first responders. We wanted to recognize them and work with them. And you can see that they are mapping the resources, they're mapping the extent of the impact, and then coming up with solutions. We wanted to make sure that we look at resilience, because resilience is critical. But often when we talk about resilience, it's always about economic resilience. So we did an impact and analysis, and we talked about 4 different categories there under resilience: education, economic, social, and gender related. So this was coming because of the women-led action research, which we call Gono Gobeshona, coming from very grassroots. Then we realized that to come back and continue with the economic well-being, livelihood, markets need to be women-friendly. So we started working with making market women-friendly, empowering women farmers to take on climate resilience, sustainable agriculture. There is that discussion at the national level, but no one has really, at that point in time, thought about how to take it to the women, to the farmers, to the community. So we took on initiatives there. Then we started analyzing the budget, the national budget, and we put in indicators to measure gender responsive climate budget. And in the initial years, there was major gaps, but it's improving. And then the whole advocacy around climate change gender action plan. And one thing I have to tell you, it didn't come easy. It wasn't rosy. We had to persist. Next slide. Now, while we are achieving some of this, there's the National Adaptation Plan, there's the Gender Action Plan. a previous speaker from Bangladesh has made references to all the policies we have. But we are working in an inherent unequal condition in a society where there's unequal power between men and women. So ActionAid again started taking that up. There was no dearth of realization that that's the context in which we are working, but we took up initiatives to help in that area. Sensitive gender impacts of climate change, social vulnerabilities, ethnicity, caste. This needed to be understood to take on any programmatic intervention. We took stock of the current resources because it's no use talking about, we can wish for the sky, but we have to work immediately with what is on the ground. So how to influence planning? We went and worked with the planning ministry, with the women's ministry, with the environment ministry. We brought out the gaps in knowledge and practice in terms of participatory ways that can capture men and women and young people's ideas and knowledge. We should not be working with the same assumption that only the experts know, there's this indigenous knowledge that needed to be captured. So this is how we felt that we could bring in the change. And we have seen, it's a 10-year journey that I can show you where the government of Bangladesh, it was from the civil society that we talked about the trust fund. They took the idea, they set up the trust fund, the national adaptation plan, the local adaptation plan, gender action plan, then now the Muji prosperity plan. This has been possible because of the consistent advocacy from civil society organization. And we invested, we did pilots, we took on programs. For a government machinery to move everything and invest in social initiatives is very difficult. But for organizations like ours, this is the advantage. We could quickly take up a research and say, let's analyze the budget. We could look at the migration issue. We have done research nationally and in South Asia level on the climate-induced migration. Some of the people I work with had to shift home 20 times because they lost their home to the river erosion, because of floods, because of disaster. So all our programming is now gender sensitive, disaster, acknowledging disaster and understanding environmental degradation. And we are also looking at this whole paradigm of development around infrastructure or engineering solutions, like water is an important issue and often river is an important issue, and then they come up with the solutions like dam. Instead of that, we are trying to come up with people's action. And I will end with that here. I'm happy to take different, more questions or respond to them. So for the region, I want to finish that we need to take gender responsive policy. We have to influence our national government. We have to influence international. At CSW66, last couple of years, we've been talking about unpaid care work. We have to make those connections. Unpaid care work, climate change, disaster, displacement. These are all connected, but when we often go out there, we have different thematic groups or we are channeled to different conversation. Then at the climate negotiation, you mentioned that the number of women in Delhi, it's still so nominal. There's lots of women in numbers, but they're not the decision makers. And in my own country, there's so much focus on experts, but when you look at the delegation, the gender aspect of it, for many years, I, by default, was representing the government and going to these negotiations and discussions, but it wasn't a planned one. It was because of my passion and some credibility with the government, so one did it. But we need to have this structure. We need to bargain on that. And it can't be just limited to a women-friendly stove or a local adaptation plan. It has to be a whole comprehensive, holistic approach. And finally, the finances and gender responsive finances are far away. There's no investment in women organizations or women's leadership to take on. And we talk a lot about localization, but we're still a far away to get there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kabir, for your eloquent insights. It's wonderful to see how this bottom-up approaches work, including the action research and how the evidence can influence policymaking. We know that the road is still long, but your experience is extremely compelling. Thank you very much. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce our next panelist, Dr. Lee Kwang Tuan of Vietnam. Dr. Tuan is the Deputy Director of Science and Technology and International Cooperation at Vietnam's Disaster Management Authority, with very compelling experience in DRR work. It is my pleasure to call upon Dr. Tuan to make his presentation. And the question I would like to ask Dr. Tuan is, to what extent have the gendered impacts of disasters and climate change been addressed in the national and subnational policies of Vietnam? And what were the key strategies and opportunities to enable the prioritization of the needs of women and the most marginalized groups? Thank you very much in advance for your intervention, and please limit it to 5 to 6 minutes because we are sort of short of time. Thank you so much. Over to you, Dr. Tuan.
Yeah, my name is Lee Kwang Tuan, and as you may know that VDMA, my office is newly established agency since August 2017 to play the state management activity on natural disaster in Vietnam, come the National Standing Office of the Central Steering Committee for Natural Disaster Protection and Control of Vietnam. We also are focus agency that implement the law on natural disaster protection and control, as well as we are focus point for implement the standard framework in Vietnam. For the given question from the conference, I would like to respond very briefly since the time is really limited. So next slide, please. Yes, for the first question, we know that gender equality is cross-cutting issue that is being highlighted in Vietnam government general policy in general and in DRNCCA for particular. To realize it in DRM, there are 4 following factors have been prioritized. The first is mainstreaming gender equality is the principle in DRM related laws. Mainstreaming gender concern into DRM policy, strategy, plan, and program is vital not only for achieving gender equality, but also for advancing community engagement in DRM. Gender equality is one of important principle in law on natural disaster prevention and control. We call the law number 33, enacted by National Assembly term 13. This principle remain in force in the amendment to number of law and legal document. The second is consideration regarding vulnerable group under the DRM law. The inclusiveness regarding vulnerable group has been recently strengthened in the revised law number 60 enacted by National Assembly number 14, term 14, through the additional inclusive and comprehensive communication and warning dissemination. Accordingly, technical guidance and advice on natural disaster prevention and control requires special consideration of such vulnerable group, including children, the elderly, pregnant women, and women having a baby under 12 months old, people with disabilities, people diagnosed with a serious disease, and the poor. Third, expanding the identification of vulnerable group in relevant policy over time. It is likely that more vulnerable groups, such ethnic minorities, household headed by women, and single parent from household categorized as a poor or nearly poor, have been included in more recent provision. For instance, the circular number 05 enacted in 2016 by the Ministry of Planning and Investment, guiding the integration of natural disaster prevention and control into the planning of sectoral and social economy development plan expanded the list of vulnerable groups to ethnic minority and household headed by women. Fourth, we promote the inclusive and participatory approach in DIM provision. The role and importance of effective community-based disaster risk management is indeed a state priority in DIM legal document. Notably, the national project on strengthening community awareness and CBDIM toward 2030 can serve as the institutional mechanism for promoting the participation of women and men in the planning process to ensure that their voice are heard. There were a guidance on mainstreaming gender in the CBDIM at the commune level, issued in 2017 to foster gender integration in activity of the national project. There are the core building block on gender mainstreaming into disaster management. That is for the first question. For the second question concerning to the key opportunity for advancing gender equality in DRR and climate change, I can say that at the national level, the use of gender statistics in disaster monitoring, preparation, and response, we have since 2018, VDMA has developed a comprehensive Vietnam disaster management monitoring system we call VNDMS to effectively monitor and manage natural disaster response. Starting in 2020 with the support from UN Women and other international organizations, VDMA has kick start of the process on integrating sex-based and disaggregated data we call SET into its national disaster risk database. The collection of SAT database was piloted in 5 provinces and shall expand to many other regions in the future. The indicators shall integrate the SAT specifically in the aspect of exposure to disaster, vulnerability, coping capacity, human, physical, and economic impact, as well as access to health service, household decision-making, and women political leadership. In the long run, the data and indicator shall be critical in producing gender analysis, which will be referred to in formulating and monitoring gender inclusive emergency response plan, as well as recovery, prevention, and mitigation strategy. The collaboration with Vietnam Women Union as the largest women organization is also always important to boost women voice and agency in disaster management. And at the regional level, Vietnam is very proactive member of ASEAN Committee for Disaster Management and other international cooperation mechanism in DRR and CCA. And lately, Hanoi recommendation for action on gender equality and in disaster risk reduction were recently reviewed and revised in the ASEAN Forum Gender in DRR about 2 months ago. The recommendation composed a very detailed list of action that the government and other actors can do to improve gender mainstreaming in DRR policy and action. So that is my response for 2 questions from the organizer.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tuan, for illustrating the national, but also the subnational efforts of Vietnam, and also the very impressive efforts to incorporate disaggregated data. I think that is a good practice for many of our viewers today. It is my great pleasure now to invite Ms. Zonibel Woods to make her presentation. She serves as a senior social development specialist at the Asian Development Banks, the ADB, with decades of impressive work fighting relentlessly for the empowerment of women and girls. And my question to Ms. Woods would be related to climate finance. We would like to know, how can we increase the quantity, quality, and accountability of climate and environmental finance as a core gender equality issue, and improve the gender responsiveness of IFI and MTB operations? And we would also like to hear from ADB's experience and tangible results in promoting these issues around gender equality and resilience outcomes. Thank you very much, and the floor is yours, Ms. Woods.
Thank you, Sylvia. I do have a few slides. Let me just adjust this. Okay, yes. Good morning, everyone, and thank you again for inviting me to participate in this important discussion. I was asked to focus my brief remarks in these 5 minutes that I have on the important issue of climate finance, and more specifically, how we may increase the level of climate finance to support gender equality and climate change work. So as we heard earlier, Asia accounts for over 50% of global greenhouse emissions, and its climate actions will determine whether the battle to avert extreme climate change will be won or lost. And ADB recently announced that it's raising its ambitions for 2019 to 2030 cumulative climate financing to $100 billion, while ensuring that at least 75% of projects will address climate change mitigation and adaptation by 2030. And with that, we also have a gender related target. We often refer to it as the twin targets of climate change and gender equality. So 75% of our operations also will focus on mainstreaming gender by 2030. So we know that the Paris Agreement is really based on 3 legs of a stool. So we're looking at mitigation, adaptation, and finance. And this underlies the importance of ensuring that gender equality and women's empowerment is also mainstreaming climate finance structures and procedures. And this also means that looking at the level of gender responsiveness of climate finance is important from the design, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation stages. So the good news is that there is a growing recognition of the importance of gender responsive climate finance. So multilateral climate funds such as the Green Climate Fund and the Climate Investment Fund have gender policies, gender action plans, and a requirement for projects to conduct gender analysis and include gender targets and designs. So my own organization, the Asian Development Bank, has also strong commitments to mainstreaming gender equality in all of our projects, including a corporate target, as I mentioned, for gender mainstreaming, and a gender equality operational plan, which includes strengthening women's resilience to shocks, including climate-related and disasters. So if I can go to the next slide, please. So I wanted to discuss some of the challenges. So first of all, we have an implementation challenge. While we have strong commitments to gender mainstreaming and climate finance, challenges remains when it comes to implementation of gender policies at the institutional level and allocating resources for gender equality. So when I speak about resources, it's not just about the financial resources, but also about the people with expertise on gender and climate change and the dedicated financial resources for implementing gender equality designs of a project. So from my experience, many climate related projects mainstream gender but they could really be more intentional and have a much more explicit focus on gender equality and women's empowerment. So as a result, we see a lot of climate change projects that have gender co-benefits, which are worthy, and we obviously welcome those, but there isn't enough of an explicit focus on gender equality. So we also have a challenge of lack of accounting of how much climate finance is gender responsive. So we have some estimates that were conducted by the OECD, for example, who has examined this issue, and they estimated that 8.6% of total ODA climate-related funding includes support for gender equality. However, another recent Oxfam report noted that only 1.5% of climate ODA identified gender equality as a primary objective. So, we have obviously insufficient resources going to climate finance, and even more so, insufficient resources going to gender equality. It's also an interesting development is that the Adaptation Fund policy now, out of all the multilateral climate funds, now has states that proposals without adequate gender considerations will just not be considered by the board. So this is really a positive development. If I can go to the next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we need to increase climate finance that has gender equality as an objective, not as a co-benefit, but to directly invest in building women's resilience to climate change at the community level. In other words, because women are disproportionately affected by climate change needs to specifically address women's needs. And this includes, as others have mentioned, work on economic empowerment and addressing social and gender norms. So at ADB, we have 4 categories for gender mainstreaming. And as I mentioned, targets for achieving gender mainstreaming by 2030. We have and provide specific guidance on how these categories are assigned at the entry, so at the beginning of a project. We have regular monitoring of gender action plans, and we allocate resources for implementing the gender action plan, and at project completion, more importantly, we look at how gender targets have been met and have a threshold for assessing if projects have been successful from a gender perspective. We also have set up a rigorous system and targets, and by 2030, 55% of our projects will have to be the 2 highest gender categories, gender mainstreaming categories that we have. The top one being that the outcome is specifically addressing gender inequality. So as highlighted by the OECD and Oxfam and many women's organizations, we also need better tracking of gender responsive climate finance. The current data tells us that it's currently woefully inadequate. But we also need to increase access by women's organizations to climate finance. Currently, most of the climate finance mechanisms offer limited scope for women's organizations, particularly those at the grassroots level, in order to, they are not able to access climate finance. So last year at ADB, we also launched the Community Resilience Partnership Program, which will support women-focused investments and, more importantly, support grassroots women so that they can work on climate change adaptation at the community level. And we're very fortunate to be working with the Huayra Commission on this initiative. And finally, it's important that we continue demonstrating and documenting results of how gender equality contributes to more effective climate change adaptation and mitigation. So that is my next slide. So, sorry, next slide, please. Yes. So some brief recommendations, because this issue, of climate finance is very large and very complex, but just some recommendations sort of from my perspective for us to consider today. So we have existing tools that we can use, such as gender responsive budgeting. Some countries in the region have commitments to dedicating budgets for gender, such as in the Philippines. that has a commitment of 5% going to gender equality. And also some countries in the region have started to implement mandates for gender responsive practices. So this is something that we can carry forward in also looking at climate finance at the country level. We also need to strengthen the technical skills on gender in climate change and disaster management bodies. We have seen limited progress on mainstreaming gender, and we know that they cannot do this alone, that they can benefit from being supported with the technical expertise from gender specialists and in particularly from women's ministries so that they can support this work. So there's an opportunity for climate disaster bodies to work closely with women's ministries responsible for gender equality. And while we may have gender included at the outset of climate change adaptation and mitigation projects, we also really need to pay more attention to the quality of these gender designs and have greater accountability for gender mainstreaming throughout the project cycle. And finally, I just also want to reiterate that we really need to establish mechanisms for women's organizations to access climate finance. This is an absolute urgent need, and as demonstrated by the impact of the pandemic, it is women and at the community level who are responsible for the resilience of communities to shocks, including climate change. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Ms. Woods, for your very eloquent illustration of the challenges around climate finance on various levels and also ADB's efforts. We're a little bit pressed for time, but I would like to throw one more last question to all three panelists to really have your insights in a 1-minute response. So please keep that to a short response to a broader question that has compelled us. So basically what we would like to hear from you is your views around the international climate negotiations being slower than necessary. What strategies would you recommend that could accelerate national and international support to uphold climate justice and advance gender equality? So what would be your brief suggestions and feedback to such a challenging question? May I pass the floor to Ms. Kabir first? Thank you.
Thank you. If you come to Bangladesh, you will see in 10 years we've made multiple advances. So we have the climate for vulnerable, we are now the Center for South Asia Adaptation, Climate, and we have the GCF funding coming, we have the advisory body and so on. So those are examples which can be taken up from the South to the North and a South-South cooperation. But end of the day, at the international negotiations, I think there's serious gap in accountability to gender responsive climate action and planning, because this is happening within the existing power dynamics. And we can't avoid that. I mean, you may fund a project, you may support, but look what happened during the COVID. Domestic violence, women who had never experienced domestic violence, the first time survivors of domestic violence. So therefore, we have to talk about what is acceptable in society. We have made very little progress on the social side. We have made progress on economic side. We are talking about climate actions. We are making progress there. Mindset, society, immediate action, and gender sensitive initiatives. So when there is domestic violence, because in the shelters, where will the woman go? Do you have a refuge? Do you have programs for psychosocial counseling? Are we supporting the society that this is not acceptable? Is the law enforcing agency really sensitive to women? I mean, we talk about law and order, but we know what happens when it's gender related crime. Now we are facing cyber crime. Now that everyone's gone on digital, we have new problems because of the whole range of problems. So I would say that the commitment to being equal, the commitment to a whole of the society approach, and a serious concerted effort to put women, girls, people with different social sexual orientation at the center, because they make up 50, 40, 60% of the society. So what improvement, what advancement are we talking about if we are leaving them behind? So all the suggestions that have been coming over and over again. Make it accessible to women, make it easy, give the finances. But you go to the international conference, you can't talk about loss and damage. You can't talk about the mechanisms for accelerating finances, technology transfer. So we in this country, at least in Bangladesh, we have not waited. We set up our trust funds. We have done multiple actions, both government and non-government actors. So we are an example there. But if the whole world doesn't come together, if the donor, ODA, donor leadership, finances coming from the climate board, these have to be channeled, and there's got to be serious accountability.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kabir, for highlighting the need to remove structural barriers and also having a synergized approach. May I request Dr. Tuan for a very brief reflection? Thank you.
Yes, as I mentioned earlier, we see a huge progress in enhancing the voice and the right of women in disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation, not only in Vietnam, but other countries and the region. Yet, the policy and regulation themselves could not fulfill all the mission and target that are set forth. But we need to realize that the practice them to rely and practice them by having a monitoring mechanism to track the implementation of this policy, regulation, and cooperation mechanism at the implementation of at the national and the regional level can be a monitoring tool for the government to develop more gender responsive and policy and related program. Additionally, we need more commitment and concrete support financially and technically from UN agency, as well as partnership to really implement this recommendation and make it happen in the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Tuan, for highlighting the need for traceability and accountability. And last but not least, final thoughts from Ms. Woods. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Sylvia. Well, I don't have much more to add, but I am reminded that a lot of these issues that we're talking about, they're not in terms of making sure that the climate change response really meets the needs of women and girls. This is nothing new. We've had these discussions since the Earth Summit. Agenda 21, has a beautiful chapter on women and environment. And I would encourage people to go back, because this is very much part of our history and trajectory of, where we have been intervening over the years on these issues. We have in the ICPD, we have a chapter on environment as well in Beijing. So all of this is over the years, we've been discussing these issues. The challenge is that what we're talking about is really an unfinished agenda on gender equality. And we need to continue to ensure that there's policy coherence and that we do not also lose sight of the other existing commitments to gender equality that are out there, including Beijing and ICPD. Because this is not, climate change issues don't happen in a vacuum, as we've heard. They're very much linked to social, economic issues. And so we need holistic approaches and solutions, and gender equality is part of that. So I think, continuing to focus and ensure that we have policy coherence and that we, as part of our climate change work, we do not forget the existing commitments that we have for gender equality out there.
Thank you very much, Ms. Woods, for these very thoughtful comments on the progress made and the journey ahead and the need for a coherent and synergized approach. I think this is a very nice recap of our panel discussion. We have come to the end of this panel segment, and we will now begin the plenary discussions. And I have the honor of passing the floor over to my colleague from UN Women, Ms. Maria Holzberg, who will be moderating the interactions and taking your questions. Thank you so very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sylvia, and the esteemed panels in the previous session and also in the session before this one. It's been a very, very interesting discussion and conversation. So we are now moving into our moderated interventions from the floor, and we just wanted to give you a little bit of an update similar to what you already heard previously, but the outcome of this consultation will be a set of recommendations on the areas for accelerated action in line with the priority theme of for the CSW66. So this will feed into the discussions and inform membership contributions to the agreed conclusions, as we've already discussed. We will now open the floor for interventions, and as done in the previous session, we will invite government representatives to share your experiences and followed by perspectives from other stakeholders. We would appreciate that you could limit your intervention to no more than 2 minutes, and we'll have that clock, as you saw in the last session, running. We appreciate if you could raise your hand and then we will accommodate your request. We also just wanted to remind that we have international sign language. So I have the honor to start with the first person on the list, which is Her Excellency Ning, Deputy Secretary General, Ministry of Environment from Cambodia, and this will be followed by Ms. Salai Koronswe, Director of Women, Ministry of Women, Children and Poverty Alleviation from Fiji. So Excellency Ning, over to you, please.
Thank you, Maria, and good afternoon from Cambodia. Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, I have a great pleasure and honor to have an opportunity as a representative from Cambodia to share our experience related to the Section 2, Regional and National Gender Transformative Policy on Climate Change, Environment and Disaster Risk Reduction. Cambodia has a low greenhouse gas emission and the most vulnerable country to the impact of the climate change. It means that the rank number 19 among 181 countries is based on Action Aid data. Due to increasing variability in its monsoon season, higher temperatures and increasing severity of frequency of flood and drought, is committed to strengthening her climate resilience. The country understands her high level of vulnerability to the effect of climate change, especially in the key sectors like agriculture, infrastructure, forestry, human health, and coastal zone. Cambodia people are impacted by climate change and disaster risk frequently due to the social position on gender, while women and girls are more severely impacted. There is a need for inclusive intervention to ensure women and girls are not only positioned as the victim of the climate change and disaster risk, but also the potential resource to address the issues at all levels. Actually, ladies and gentlemen, the real government of Cambodia has already made good progress in the national policy framework, especially in the mainstream and mainstreaming climate change into national and subnational planning and budget planning. The Royal Government of Cambodia contribute to realizing the gender, especially and women power in the climate change action and disaster risk reduction by continue to develop and strengthen the national gender and mainstreaming policy, guidelines, strategy, and action plan and mechanism, such as Cambodia developed climate change strategy plan 2014 to 2023, aiming to develop a country toward a green, low carbon, climate resilient, equitable, sustainable, and knowledge-based society. The fourth rectangular strategy 2018-2033 integrate climate change under its sustainability and inclusive pillar. The country has also developed a strategic national action plan for disaster risk reduction, NEP-DRR, 2019 to 2023 that aim to guarantee whole of government response for the risk for the disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. In addition, the government have ensured that coordination on gender and climate action inter-ministry climate change technical working group led by National Council for Sustainable Development. Within the update NDC, which was submitted to the UNFPA in December 2020, gender responsive have been included. Cambodia is also committing to reduce 42% of the emission by 2030, compared to a business as usual scenario and both adaptation and mitigation commitment have a gender equality target included. Related to the mitigation measure, the NDC highlight the linking between gender equality and social inclusion and connection to effort on climate change on the key mitigation area. In terms of adaptation, NDC recognize the potential to increase the women income generation and decrease the work burden through access to the technology and participation opportunity. Cambodia recently launched NDC online tracking system, which the gender specific include on mainstreaming gender indicators is under the immediate action. Strengthening gender mainstreaming through development guidelines to mainstream gender to include disaster management, which was produced by NCDM to realize GM work. Cambodia has also launched circular economy strategy and action plan 2021, sustainable consumption and production.
Your Excellency, may I ask you to please wrap up, kindly conclude your intervention just in interest of time. Apologies.
Thank you. I stop there and I thank you very much for your attention, and I will send this intervention to the Secretariat of Convention. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Your Excellency, and that's a good prompt to also kindly ask the Secretariat to add the email to which colleagues can email their interventions also for record keeping. So I appreciate that. We now give the floor to Ms. Koroversi, Director of Women, Ministry of Women, Children and Poverty Alleviation from Fiji, and this will be followed by Mr. Khan from the Director of Ministry of Human Rights from Pakistan. So over to you, Ms. Koroversi.
Thank you, Naka Maria. Excellencies, distinguished panelists and delegates. In line with the theme for our plenary 2 on regional and national gender transformative policies on climate change, environment, and disaster risk reduction. Of course, Fiji is no exception when it comes to the vulnerability of women and girls on the impact of climate change and disasters. And this is, of course, amplified with the pre-existing gender inequalities, such as gender-based violence, unpaid care work, lack of access to information on basic DRR, and practically just most of the things that our panelists in the first plenary and in this plenary have mentioned. So, and in addition to the lack of data and evidence for gender analysis, to identify gaps that will inform the development of socially inclusive strategies the National Women's Machinery is currently implementing a number of key initiatives to address this. And one such initiative, and this has the Fijian government through cabinet decisions, is currently implementing a gender transformative institutional capacity development initiative using a whole of government approach. So this initiative includes the use of gender mainstreaming and gender responsive programming and budgeting as tools to create an enabling environment to ensure that the integration of all women and girls' needs, interests, concerns, contributions, and perspectives into policies, strategies, programs, and budgets. And with the establishment of effective coordination mechanisms, as well as enhancing technical knowledge, competence, and resources on transformative gender mainstreaming across our government institutions. So this also sees the establishment of gender mainstreaming action groups, who in turn will develop gender mainstreaming action plans for implementation throughout government. So our National Women's Machinery, we work very closely with our civil society organizations, our faith-based organization, and the NGOs. We are the lead agency for the rollout of the gender transformative institutional capacity development initiative in partnership with the Ministry of Economy and with the technical assistance of one of our CSOs in Fiji, the Fiji Women's Rights Movement. And it is envisioned that with the complete rollout of the Gender Transformative Institutional Capacity Development Initiative, the key agencies that are mandated to administer our national legislations, policies, and programs on climate change, environment, and disaster risk reduction will carry out possible reviews using a gender transformative approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sincere appreciation. I would like to now give the floor to Mr. Khan, Director of the Ministry of Human Rights from Pakistan, and this will be followed by Mr. Singh, a member of the National Planning Commission in Nepal, please.
Thank you, ma'am. Very good morning from Pakistan. I am Shahzad Ahmed, Director, Ministry of Human Rights. Very good discussion on the subject and informing the participant about the initiatives being taken at the international, national, regional level. Ma'am, basically Ministry of Human Rights along with the partners like Ministry of Climate Change and National Disaster Management Authorities are taking initiative for protection of women in disaster and climate change related issues. And Ministry of Human Rights, along with its partners like National Commission on the Status of Women and National Commission for Child Rights and National Commission for Human Rights, as well as National Commission for Minorities, are working for the promotion of human rights in all areas. Ministry of Human Rights is basically the leading ministry at the national level to deal with issues related to gender. And Pakistan had a devolution of powers in 2011, and as a result of women development subject transfer to the provincial government. Currently, ministry is also looking after the national policy for development and empowerment of women prepared by the government of Pakistan. As a result of Beijing Platform for Action, we had also prepared National Action Plan for Women. It has also exclusive chapter on women and environment. And as a result, Ministry of Human Rights has also tried to intervene in the development projects. And as a result of efforts made by the ministry, now it is mandatory for the planning division, while they are reviewing the planning documents, the gender impact analysis and environmental impact analysis have been made mandatory while reviewing the projects. The government of Pakistan, under the Ministry of Climate Change, has prepared a national climate change policy in 2012, which has been updated in 2021. The policy basically recognizes that women are powerful change of agent, and gender is also being considered in other policies like national water policy, national food security policy, and national disaster risk reduction policy. These have also discussed gender-related issues. However, gender mainstreaming is also considered in other policies, and National Gender Climate Change Committee has been established in the Ministry of Climate Change. It endorses the following, you can say, priority areas for national climate change, a gender action plan. These includes agriculture and food security, water and sanitation, disaster risk management, including social protection and health, forestry and biodiversity, integrated coastal management, mitigation, energy. Then there are different issues and gaps in the field of women climate change which are needs to be addressed. For example, lack of gender disaggregated data, women's participation, lack of access to clean drinking water and hygienic facilities, lack of education and awareness programs for local communities, financial assistance for longer period, as well as awareness among females to choose forestry as a profession, land ownership related issues, and training and information session for women, field work and equipment and facilities to female students. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And may I remind all participants to please also try to maintain the 2 minutes threshold. The notes will be reflecting your full contribution. I now move over to Saloni Pradhan Singh, member of the National Planning Commission for Nepal, and this will be followed by Ms. Geeta Suwandi, Head of Program and Budgeting in the National Authority for Disaster Management of Indonesia. Ms. Saloni Singh, the floor is yours.
Good morning.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
We hear you well.
Namaste from Nepal.
Namaste.
And as everybody knows, Nepal is very highly vulnerable to climate change with huge big Himalayas which is melting every day. So in this context, Nepal participated very visibly in COP26 and so its commitment to ensure gender responsive and ensuring all vulnerable people to be protected by this climate changing impacts by 2030. And it has also, over the time, it has also developed several gender responsive policies and plans like climate change policy in 2019, which has a very comprehensive plan for gender responsiveness. Gender and climate change strategy of 2020 dedicated strongly with the action plan with sectoral intervention, agriculture, forest, water resources, health, and all which has gender mainstreaming policy. Forest plan policy in 2019 has emphasized and put provision of 50% participation of women with leadership position with fair equitable sharing of the benefits from forests. Nepal has also been considered as a role model in NDC, especially in determining contribution of women. National Disaster Risk Reduction Policy of 2018 is gender responsive, has developed a gender responsive physical infrastructure and public service inclusive monitoring plan. Disaster Risk Reduction and Management DRRM Act 2017 encouraged to consider gender and social inclusion, including women, people living with disability, and vulnerable and marginalized social groups while developing activities, outcomes, and indicators related to disaster risk reduction. Representation of women from local executive is reserved in the task force for the formulation of local plans. National Adaptation Plan 2021 has recognized very heavily on gender as a cross-cutting sectoral adaptation issue.
gender and disaster responsive local level adaptation plan, which is very famously known as LAPA. Preparation and implementation is ongoing with huge emphasis on gender responsiveness. However, there is a huge gap in sectoral gender integration in policies, programs, and implementation of human resources, and it has as Farah said, in addition to the inherent gender disparities at the social and attitudinal level, the policies are there, but the challenge is how to implement. Therefore, I would also like to join my good friend Farah Kabir to have to call on international communities and local governments and regional machineries to come together to address this, address the gap between policies and implementation. So we need to come together to address the issue so that it is realized at the local level. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam Singh. I now hand the floor over to Ms. Geeta Sewandi, Head of Program and Budgeting, National Authority for Disaster Management of Indonesia. And I will make a note after your intervention, and we will open the floor for non-state actors as well. Over to you, Ms. Sewandi.
Thank you so much, Maria, for this opportunity. So I would like to thank you to all of the speakers for your excellent presentations and also information in regards to the gender and also responsiveness to disabilities. So on behalf of the National Authority for Disaster Management of Indonesia, I'd like to share some information, especially in regards to the data collection, which are responsive to gender and disability in Indonesia. Regarding the gender and disability responsive data collection, the government of Indonesia, in collaboration with UNDP and also JICA from Japan, developed a web-based disaster dashboard called Inarisk and Inarisk Personal. The data presented in it are in the form of statistical and spatial data, which in the process and presentation involve the community, which is of course based on inclusiveness. Currently, its development continues to be carried out by providing various kinds of information related to disasters, climate change, and as well as the additional tools to increase the capacity of the central and local governments in Indonesia. Moreover, to increase community resilience to disasters. It's a free access website so that it's reachable and accessible to all of the citizens, and also to overcome the problem of the gender equality in Indonesia. Thank you so much, Maria, for the time.
Many thanks, and also for staying under time. We now hand the floor over to Dr. Soma KP, academic and national facilitator for women's farmers' rights in India. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Greetings to everybody who's in the session here today. I really appreciate the discussion and the focus on working collaboratively in the region. And I speak from the perspective of women farmers at the grassroots level in farming communities, in forest dweller communities, to be able to reach out to policymakers. We need the support of organizations that can help us to collaborate regionally, to build our voices and our leadership to represent the issues from the communities of women farmers and working women across rural areas. For that, we need a lot more interface with community-based institutions from state agencies and academic institutions to build these regional platforms. And I would urge CSW and all the members present here to look at these as critical issues to bring the voices of grassroots women into the debates so that they can represent their priorities and not just have to deal with the hand-me-downs that are coming in the form of policy diktats very often, for which they have neither the access to the technologies nor the tools to respond. So if community-based strategies are strengthened, then certainly communities have been known to offer stronger resilience, stronger innovation, and greater collective action to address climate action. And this will also result in climate justice so that those at the bottom of the pyramid are able to bring their voices into determining how planning happens and how actions roll out at the grassroots level to benefit the most marginalized as well. I'll stop here. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Greetings to everyone.
Thank you for this very critical perspective. And I will give the last floor to Miranli Rai, Women for Biodiversity. Last point for this session for you.
Thank you, Maria. Once again, sorry if I'm taking the floor again, but this is a really very important session, and I just want to focus on two things. One is that there needs to be synergies. I saw a lot of mention about the climate reporting, but there's also other reportings and how there could be a systematic monitoring on looking at gender responsive actions and policies that are relevant for all the other MEAs, including this work on biodiversity, which has got the report, the NBSAP's reporting. So I think on that level, I think it'll be really very important to see how it could be streamlined to also, this is, I'm again coming from a biodiversity perspective, because I think it's a very monumental time for us to engage, considering that the biodiversity framework for 30 years is being negotiated currently. And all of us who are here and at the CSW and other forums has a very important part to play to ensure that this biodiversity framework has gender into its policies. So I'm just going to again finish at that and hopefully be able to contribute further in the other discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a very good intervention and something that can be carried forward into the subsequent sessions in this regional consultation. That concludes our interventions from the floor, and I would like to give great thanks to all colleagues who have taken the time to share reflections and also remind everyone that they can send written input directly to the Secretariat. We have a number of questions on the chat, which we will take into consideration and follow through into the next subsequent sessions, as well as to respond to. And with all of this, I have the pleasure to hand back to my colleague Chani. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Holzberg, and thank you, Ms. Lihel, as well, for your wonderfully able moderation of this session. Also, a big thank you to all panelists and to all of the participants who has delivered remarks during the plenary sessions, for sharing your insights into policies for a gender transformative approach to climate change, environment, and disaster risk reduction. And this, dear participants, brings us to the end of our agenda for the first day of this regional consultation. Please join us at 9:30 tomorrow, Standard Thailand time, for our final panel discussion and review of the recommendations. We wish you a very good morning, afternoon, and evening ahead, wherever you are. Thank you.